Chapter 1 of The Mark of Zorro. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Mark of Zorro by Johnston McCulley. Chapter 1. Pedro the Boaster. Again the sheet of rain beat against the roof of red Spanish tile, and the wind shrieked like a soul in torment, and smoke puffed from the big fireplace as the sparks were showered over the hard dirt floor. "'Tis a night for evil deeds," declared Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez, stretching his great feet in their loose boots toward the roaring fire and grasping the hilt of his sword in one hand and a mug filled with thin wine in the other. "Devils howl in the wind and demons are in the raindrops. 'Tis an evil night indeed, eh, senor?" "It is," the fat landlord agreed hastily, and he made haste also to fill the wine mug again, for Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had a temper that was terrible when aroused, as it always was when wine was not forthcoming. "An evil night," the big sergeant repeated, and drained the mug without stopping to draw breath, a feat that had attracted considerable attention in its time and had gained the sergeant a certain amount of notoriety up and down El Camino Real, as they called the highway that connected the missions in one long chain. Gonzalez sprawled closer to the fire, and cared not that other men thus were robbed of some of its warmth. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez often had expressed his belief that a man should look out for his own comfort before considering others, and being of great size and strength, and having much skill with the blade, he found few who had the courage to declare that they believed otherwise. Outside the wind shrieked, and the rain dashed against the ground in a solid sheet. It was a typical February storm for Southern California. At the missions, the frailes had cared for the stock and had closed the buildings for the night. At every great hacienda, big fires were burning in the houses. The timid natives kept to their little adobe huts, glad for shelter. And here in the little pueblo of Reina de los Angeles, where in years to come a great city would grow, the tavern on one side of the plaza housed for the time being men who would sprawl before the fire until the dawn, rather than face the beating rain. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez, by virtue of his rank and size, hogged the fireplace, and a corporal and 3 soldiers from the Presidio sat at table a little in rear of him, drinking their thin wine and playing at cards. An Indian servant crouched on his heels in one corner, no neophyte who had accepted the religion of the frailes, but a Gentile and renegade. For this was in the day of the decadence of the missions, and there was little peace between the robed Franciscans who followed in the footsteps of the sainted Junipero Serra, who had founded the first mission at San Diego de la Cala, and thus made possible an empire, and those who followed the politicians and had high places in the army. The men who drank wine in the tavern at Reina de los Angeles had no wish for a spying neophyte about them. Just now conversation had died out, a fact that annoyed the fat landlord and caused him some fear, for Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez in an argument was Sergeant Gonzalez at peace, and unless he could talk the big soldier might feel moved to action and start a brawl. Twice before Gonzalez had done so, to the great damage of furniture and men's faces, and the landlord had appealed to the commandante of the Presidio, Captain Ramon, only to be informed that the captain had an abundance of troubles of his own, and that running an inn was not one of them. So the landlord regarded Gonzalez warily, and edged closer to the long table, and spoke in an attempt to start a general conversation and so avert trouble. "They are saying in the pueblo," he announced, "that this Señor Zorro is abroad again." His words had an effect that was both unexpected and terrible to witness. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez hurled his half-filled wine mug to the hard dirt floor, straightened suddenly on the bench, and crashed a ponderous fist down upon the table, causing wine mugs and cards and coins to scatter in all directions. The corporal and the 3 soldiers retreated a few feet in sudden fright, and the red face of the landlord blanched. The native sitting in the corner started to creep toward the door, having determined that he preferred the storm outside to the big sergeant's anger. "Señor Zorro, eh?" Gonzales cried in a terrible voice. "Is it my fate always to hear that name? Señor Zorro, eh? Mr. Fox, in other words. He imagines, I take it, that he is as cunning as one. By the saints, he raises as much stench." Gonzales gulped, turned to face them squarely, and continued his tirade. "He runs up and down the length of El Camino Real like a goat of the high hills. He wears a mask, and he flashes a pretty blade, they tell me. He uses the point of it to carve his hated letter Z on the cheek of his foe. Ha! The Mark of Zorro, they are calling it. A pretty blade he has, in truth. But I cannot swear as to the blade. I have never seen it. He will not do me the honor of letting me see it. Señor Zorro's depredations never occur in the vicinity of Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez. Perhaps the Señor Zorro can tell us the reason for that. Ha!" He glared at the men before him, threw up his upper lip, and let the ends of his great black moustache bristle. "They are calling him the Curse of Capistrano now," the fat landlord observed, stooping to pick up the wine mug and cards and hoping to filch a coin in the process. "Curse of the entire highway and the whole mission chain!" Sergeant Gonzalez roared. "A cutthroat he is! A thief! Ha! A common fellow presuming to get him a reputation for bravery because he robs a hacienda or so, and frightens a few women and natives. Señor Zorro, eh? Here is one fox it gives me pleasure to hunt. Curse of Capistrano, eh? I know I have led an evil life, but I only ask of the saints one thing now, that they forgive me my sins long enough to grant me the boon of standing face to face with this pretty highwayman." "There is a reward," the landlord began. "You snatched the very words from my lips," Sergeant Gonzalez protested. "There is a pretty reward for the fellow's capture, offered by His Excellency the Governor. And what good fortune has come to my blade? I am away on duty at San Juan Capistrano, and the fellow makes his play at Santa Barbara. I am at Reina de Los Angeles, and he takes a fat purse at San Luis Rey. I dine at San Gabriel, let us say, and he robs at San Diego de la Acala. A pest he is. Once I meet him—" Sergeant Gonzalez choked on his wrath, and reached for the wine mug, which the landlord had filled again and placed at his elbow. He gulped down the contents. "Well, he has never visited us here," the landlord said with a sigh of thanksgiving. "Good reason, fat one. Ample reason. We have a presidio here and a few soldiers. He rides far from any presidio, does this pretty Señor Zorro. He is like a fleeting sunbeam, I grant him that, and with about as much real courage." Sergeant Gonzalez relaxed on the bench again, and the landlord gave him a glance that was full of relief, and began to hope that there would be no breakage of mugs and furniture and men's faces this rainy night. "Yet this Señor Zorro must rest at times. He must eat and sleep," the landlord said. "It is certain that he must have some place for hiding and recuperation. Some fine day the soldiers will trail him to his den." "Ha!" Gonzalez replied. "Of course the man has to eat and sleep. And what is it that he claims now? He says that he is no real thief, by the saints. He is but punishing those who mistreat the men of the missions, he says. Friend of the oppressed, eh? He left a placard at Santa Barbara recently stating as much, did he not? Ha! And what may be the reply to that? The frailes of the missions are shielding him, hiding him, giving him his meat and drink. Shake down a robed fray, and you'll find some trace of this pretty highwayman's whereabouts. Else I am a lazy civilian. I have no doubt that you speak the truth, the landlord replied. I put it not past the frailes to do such a thing, but may this Señor Zorro never visit us here. And why not, fat one? Sergeant Gonzalez cried in a voice of thunder. Am I not here? Have I not a blade at my side? Are you an owl? Or is this daylight that you cannot see as far as the end of your puny crooked nose? By the saints! I mean, said the landlord quickly and with some alarm, that I have no wish to be robbed. To be robbed of what, fat one? Of a jug of weak wine and a meal? Have you riches, fool? Ha! Let the fellow come. Let this bold and cunning Señor Zorro but enter that door and step before us. Let him make a bow, as they say he does, and let his eyes twinkle through his mask. Let me but face the fellow for an instant, and I claim the generous reward offered by his excellency. He perhaps is afraid to venture so near the Presidio, the landlord said. More wine! Gonzales howled. More wine, fat one, and place it to my account. When I have earned the reward, you shall be paid in full. I promise it on my word as a soldier. Ha! Were this brave and cunning Señor Zorro, this curse of Capistrano, but to make entrance at that door now... The door suddenly was opened. Chapter 2. On the Heels of the Storm. In came a gust of wind and rain and a man with it, and the candles flickered and one was extinguished. This sudden entrance in the midst of the sergeant's boast startled them all, and Gonzales drew his blade halfway from its scabbard as his words died in his throat. The native was quick to close the door again to keep out the wind. The newcomer turned and faced them. The landlord gave another sigh of relief. It was not Señor Zorro, of course. It was Don Diego Vega, a fair youth of excellent blood and 24 years, noted the length of El Camino Real for his small interest in the really important things of life. Ha! Gonzales cried, and slammed his blade home. Is it that I startled you somewhat, señores? Don Diego asked politely and in a thin voice, glancing around the big room and nodding to the men before him. If you did, señor, it was because you entered on the heels of the storm, the sergeant retorted. 'Twould not be your own energy that would startle any man. Grunted Don Diego, throwing aside his sombrero and flinging off his soaked serape. Your remarks border on the perilous, my raucous friend. Can it be that you intend to take me to task? It is true, continued Don Diego, that I do not have a reputation for riding like a fool at the risk of my neck, fighting like an idiot with every newcomer, and playing the guitar under every woman's window like a simpleton. Yet I do not care to have these things you deem my shortcomings flaunted in my face. Ah! Gonzales cried, half in anger. We have an agreement, Sergeant Gonzales, that we can be friends, and I can forget the wide difference in birth and breeding that yawns between us, only as long as you curb your tongue and stand my comrade. Your boasts amuse me, and I buy for you the wine that you crave. It is a pretty arrangement. But ridicule me again, senor, either in public or private, and the agreement is at an end. I may mention that I have some small influence. Oh, your pardon, caballero, and my very good friend. the alarmed Sergeant Gonzales cried now. "You are storming worse than the tempest outside, and merely because my tongue happened to slip. Hereafter, if any man ask, you are nimble of wit and quick with a blade, always ready to fight or to make love. You are a man of action, caballero. Ha! Does any dare doubt it?" He glared around the room, half drawing his blade again, and then he slammed the sword home and threw back his head and roared with laughter, and then clapped Don Diego between the shoulders. And the fat landlord hurried with more wine, knowing well that Don Diego Vega would stand the score. For this peculiar friendship between Don Diego and Sergeant Gonzales was the talk of El Camino Real. Don Diego came from a family of blood that ruled over thousands of broad acres, countless herds of horses and cattle, great fields of grain. Don Diego, in his own right, had a hacienda that was like a small empire, and a house in the pueblo also, and was destined to inherit from his father more than thrice what he had now. But Don Diego was unlike the other full-blooded youths of the times. It appeared that he disliked action. He seldom wore his blade, except as a matter of style and apparel. He was damnably polite to all women and paid court to none. He sat in the sun and listened to the wild tales of other men, and now and then he smiled. He was the opposite of Sergeant Pedro Gonzales in all things, and yet they were together frequently. It was as Don Diego had said. He enjoyed the sergeant's boasts, and the sergeant enjoyed the free wine. What more could either ask in the way of a fair arrangement? Now Don Diego went to stand before the fire and dry himself, holding a mug of red wine in one hand. He was only medium in size, yet he possessed health and good looks, and it was the despair of proud dueñas that he would not glance a second time at the pretty señoritas they protected, and for whom they sought desirable husbands. Gonzales, afraid that he had angered his friend and that the free wine would be at an end, now strove to make peace. "Caballero, we have been speaking of this notorious Señor Zorro," he said. "We have been regarding in conversation this fine curse of Capistrano, as some nimble-witted fool has seen fit to term the pest of the highway." "What about him?" Don Diego asked, putting down his wine mug and hiding a yawn behind his hand. Those who knew Don Diego best declared he yawned 10 times a day. "I have been remarking, caballero," said the sergeant, "that this fine Señor Zorro never appears in my vicinity, and that I am hoping the good saints will grant me the chance of facing him some fine day, that I may claim the reward offered by the governor. Señor Zorro, eh? Ha!" "Let us not speak of him," Don Diego begged, turning from the fireplace and throwing out one hand as if in protest. "Shall it be that I never hear of anything except deeds of bloodshed and violence? Would it be possible in these turbulent times for a man to listen to words of wisdom regarding music or the poets?" "Meal mush and goat's milk!" snorted Sergeant Gonzales in huge disgust. "If this Señor Zorro wishes to risk his neck, let him. It is his own neck, by the saints. A cutthroat, a thief, ha!" "I have been hearing considerable concerning his work," Don Diego went on to say. "The fellow, no doubt, is sincere in his purpose. He has robbed none except officials who have stolen from the missions and the poor, and punished none except brutes who mistreat natives. He has slain no man, I understand. Let him have his little day in the public eye, my sergeant." "I would rather have the reward." "Earn it," Don Diego said. "Capture the man." "Ha! Dead or alive, the governor's proclamation says. I myself have read it." "Then stand you up to him and run him through, if such a thing pleases you," Don Diego retorted. and tell me all about it afterward. But spare me now."
"It will be a pretty story," Gonzales cried, "and you shall have it entire, caballero, word by word. How I played with him, how I laughed at him as we fought, how I pressed him back after a time and ran him through."
"Afterward, but not now," Don Diego cried, exasperated. "Landlord, more wine! The only manner in which to stop this raucous boaster is to make his wide throat so slick with wine that the words cannot climb out of it." The landlord quickly filled the mugs. Don Diego sipped at his wine slowly, as a gentleman should, while Sergeant Gonzales took his in 2 great gulps. And then the scion of the house of Vega stepped across to the bench and reached for his sombrero and his serape.
"What?" the sergeant cried. "You are going to leave us at such an early hour, caballero? You are going to face the fury of that beating storm?"
"At least, I am brave enough for that," Don Diego replied, smiling. "I but ran over from my house for a pot of honey. The fools feared the rain too much to fetch me some this day from the hacienda. Get me one, landlord."
"I shall escort you safely home through the rain," Sergeant Gonzales cried,
for he knew full well that Don Diego had excellent wine of age there. "You shall remain here before the roaring fire," Don Diego told him firmly. "I do not need an escort of soldiers from the Presidio to cross the plaza. I am going over accounts with my secretary, and possibly may return to the tavern after we have finished. I wanted the pot of honey that we might eat as we worked."
"Ha! And why did you not send that secretary of yours for the honey, caballero? Why be wealthy and have servants if a man cannot send them on errands on such a stormy night?"
"He is an old man and feeble," Don Diego explained. "He also is secretary to my aged father. The storm would kill him. Landlord, serve all here with wine and put it to my account. I may return when my books have been straightened." Don Diego Vega picked up the pot of honey, wrapped his serape around his head, opened the door, and plunged into the storm and darkness.
"There goes a man!" Gonzales cried, flourishing his arms. "He is my friend, that caballero, and I would have all men know it. He seldom wears a blade, and I doubt whether he can use one, but he is my friend. The flashing dark eyes of lovely señoritas do not disturb him, yet I swear he is a pattern of a man. Music and the poets, eh? Ha! Has he not the right, if such is his pleasure? Is he not Don Diego Vega? Has he not blue blood and broad acres and great storehouses filled with goods? Is he not liberal? He may stand on his head or wear petticoats, if it please him. Yet I swear he is a pattern of a man."
The soldiers echoed his sentiments, since they were drinking Don Diego's wine and did not have the courage to combat the sergeant's statements anyway. The fat landlord served them with another round, since Don Diego would pay. For it was beneath a Vega to look at his score in a public tavern, and the fat landlord many times had taken advantage of that fact.
"He cannot endure the thought of violence or bloodshed," Sergeant Gonzales continued. "He is as gentle as a breeze of spring. Yet he has a firm wrist and a deep eye. It merely is the caballero's manner of seeing life. Did I but have his youth and good looks and riches, ha! There would be a stream of broken hearts from San Diego de Alcala to San Francisco de Assis."
"And broken heads," the corporal offered.
"Ha! And broken heads, comrade! I would rule the country. No youngster should stand long in my way. Out with blade and at them! Cross Pedro Gonzales, eh? Ha! Through the shoulder, neatly, ha! Through a lung!"
Gonzales was upon his feet now, and his blade had leaped from its scabbard. He swept it back and forth through the air, thrust, parried, lunged, advanced and retreated, shouted his oaths, and roared his laughter as he fought with shadows.
"That is the manner of it!" he screeched at the fireplace. "What have we here? Two of you against one? Ha! So much the better, signores! We love brave odds! Ha! Have at you, dog! Die, hound! One side, poltroon!"
He reeled against the wall, gasping, his breath almost gone, the point of his blade resting on the floor, his great face purple with the exertion and the wine he had consumed, while the corporal and the soldiers and the fat landlord laughed long and loudly at this bloodless battle from which Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had emerged the unquestioned victor.
Were this fine, Señor Zorro, only before me here and now!" the sergeant gasped.
And again the door was opened suddenly, and a man entered the inn on a gust of the storm. Chapter 3. Señor Zorro Pays a Visit. The native hurried forward to fasten the door against the force of the wind, and then retreated to his corner again. The newcomer had his back toward those in the long room. They could see that his sombrero was pulled far down on his head, as if to prevent the wind from whisking it away, and that his body was enveloped in a long cloak that was wringing wet. With his back still toward them, he opened the cloak and shook the raindrops from it, and then folded it across his breast again as the fat landlord hurried forward, rubbing his hands together in expectation, for he deemed that here was some caballero off the highway who would pay good coin for food and bed and care for his horse. When the landlord was within a few feet of him and the door, the stranger whirled around. The landlord gave a little cry of fear and retreated with speed. The corporal gurgled deep down in his throat. The soldiers gasped. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez allowed his lower jaw to drop and let his eyes bulge. For the man who stood straight before them had a black mask over his face that effectually concealed his features, and through the two slits in it his eyes glittered ominously.
"Ha! What have we here?"
Gonzalez gasped, finally, some presence of mind returning to him. The man before them bowed.
"Señor Zorro, at your service," he said. "By the saints! Señor Zorro, eh?"
Gonzalez cried.
"Do you doubt it, señor?" "If you are indeed Señor Zorro, then have you lost your wits," the sergeant declared.
"What is the meaning of that speech?"
"You are here, are you not? You have entered the inn, have you not? By all the saints, you have walked into a trap, my pretty highwayman."
"Will the señor please explain?" Señor Zorro asked. His voice was deep and held a peculiar ring.
"Are you blind? Are you without sense?"
Gonzalez demanded.
"Am I not here?"
"And what has that to do with it?"
"Am I not a soldier?"
"At least you wear a soldier's garb, señor."
"By the saints, and cannot you see the good corporal and three of our comrades? Have you come to surrender your wicked sword, señor? Are you finished playing at rogue?"
Señor Zorro laughed, not unpleasantly, but he did not take his eyes from Gonzalez.
"Most certainly I have not come to surrender," he said. "I am on business, señor." "Business?" Gonzalez queried.
4 days ago, señor, you brutally beat a native who had won your dislike. The affair happened on the road between here and the mission at San Gabriel.
"He was a surly dog and got in my way. And how does it concern you, my pretty highwayman?"
"I am the friend of the oppressed, señor, and I have come to punish you."
"Come to punish me, fool? You punish me? I shall die of laughter before I can run you through. You are as good as dead, Señor Zorro. His Excellency has offered a pretty price for your carcass. If you are a religious man, say your prayers. I would not have it said that I slew a man without giving him time to repent his crimes. I give you the space of 100 heartbeats."
"You are generous, señor, but there is no need for me to say my prayers.
Then must I do my duty, said Gonzales, and lifted the point of his blade. Corporal, you will remain by the table, and the men also. This fellow and the reward he means are mine. He blew out the ends of his mustache and advanced carefully, not making the mistake of underestimating his antagonist, for there had been certain tales of the man's skill with the blade. And when he was within the proper distance, he recoiled suddenly, as if a snake had warned of a strike. For Señor Zorro had allowed one hand to come from beneath his cloak, and the hand held a pistol, most damnable of weapons to Sergeant Gonzales. "Back, señor," Señor Zorro warned. "Ha! So that is the way of it!" Gonzales cried. "You carry that devil's weapon and threaten men with it. Such things are for use only at a long distance and against inferior foes. Gentlemen prefer the trusty blade." "Back, señor. There is death in this you call the devil's weapon. I shall not warn again." "Somebody told me you were a brave man," Gonzales taunted, retreating a few feet. "It has been whispered that you would meet any man foot to foot and cross blades with him. I have believed it of you. And now I find you resorting to a weapon fit for nothing except to use against red natives. Can it be, señor, that you lack the courage I have heard you possess?" Señor Zorro laughed again. "As to that, you shall see presently," he said. "The use of this pistol is necessary at the present time. I find myself pitted against large odds in this tavern, señor. I shall cross blades with you gladly when I have made such a proceeding safe." "I wait anxiously," Gonzales sneered. "The corporal and soldiers will retreat to that far corner," Señor Zorro directed. "Landlord, you will accompany them. The native will go there also. Quickly, señores!" "Thank you. I do not wish to have any of you disturbing me while I am punishing the sergeant here." "Ha!" Gonzales screeched in fury. "We shall soon see as to the punishing, my pretty fox." "I shall hold the pistol in my left hand," Señor Zorro continued. "I shall engage this sergeant with my right, in the proper manner, and as I fight I shall keep an eye on the corner. The first move from any of you, señores, means that I fire. I am expert with this you have termed the devil's weapon, and if I fire some men shall cease to exist on this earth of ours. It is understood?" The corporal and soldiers and landlord did not take the trouble to answer. Señor Zorro looked Gonzales straight in the eyes again, and a chuckle came from behind his mask. "Sergeant, you will turn your back until I can draw my blade," he directed. "I give you my word as a caballero that I shall not make a foul attack." "As a caballero?" Gonzales sneered. "I said it, señor," Zorro replied, his voice ringing a threat. Gonzales shrugged his shoulders and turned his back. In an instant he heard the voice of the highwayman again. "On guard, señor!" Chapter 4 Swords Clash and Pedro Explains. Gonzales whirled at the word, and his blade came up. He saw that Señor Zorro had drawn his sword, and that he was holding the pistol in his left hand high above his head. Moreover, Señor Zorro was chuckling still, and the sergeant became infuriated. The blades clashed. Sergeant Gonzales had been accustomed to battling with men who gave ground when they pleased and took it when they could, who went this way and that, seeking an advantage, now advancing, now retreating, now swinging to left or right as their skill directed them. But here he faced a man who fought in quite a different way. For Señor Zorro, it appeared, was as if rooted to one spot and unable to turn his face in any other direction. He did not give an inch, nor did he advance, nor step to either side. Gonzales attacked furiously, as was his custom, and he found the point of his blade neatly parried. He used more caution then, and tried what tricks he knew, but they seemed to avail him nothing. He attempted to pass around the man before him, and the other's blade drove him back.
He tried a retreat, hoping to draw the other out, but Señor Zorro stood his ground and forced Gonzales to attack again. As for the highwayman, he did not except put up a defence. Anger got the better of Gonzales then, for he knew the corporal was jealous of him, and that the tale of this fight would be told to all the pueblo tomorrow, and so travel up and down the length of El Camino Real. He attacked furiously, hoping to drive Señor Zorro off his feet and make an end of it. But he found that his attack ended as if against a stone wall. His blade was turned aside, his breast crashed against that of his antagonist, and Señor Zorro merely threw out his chest and hurled him back half a dozen steps.
"Fight, Señor,"
Señor Zorro said.
"Fight yourself, cutthroat and thief!" the exasperated sergeant cried. "Don't stand like a piece of the hills, fool! Is it against your religion to take a step?"
"You cannot taunt me into doing it," the highwayman replied, chuckling again. Sergeant Gonzales realized then that he had been angry, and he knew an angry man cannot fight with the blade as well as a man who controls his temper. So he became deadly cold now, and his eyes narrowed, and all boasting was gone from him. He attacked again, but now he was alert, seeking an unguarded spot through which he could thrust without courting disaster himself. He fenced as he never had fenced in his life before. He cursed himself for having allowed wine and food to rob him of his wind. From the front, from either side, he attacked, only to be turned back again, all his tricks solved almost before he tried them. He had been watching his antagonist's eyes, of course, and now he saw a change. They had seemed to be laughing through the mask, and now they had narrowed and seemed to send forth flakes of fire.
"We have had enough of playing," Señor Zorro said. "It is time for the punishment."
And suddenly he began to press the fighting, taking step after step, slowly and methodically going forward and forcing Gonzales backwards. The tip of his blade seemed to be a serpent's head with 1,000 tongues. Gonzales felt himself at the other's mercy, but he gritted his teeth and tried to control himself, and fought on. Now he was with his back against the wall, but in such a position that Señor Zorro could give him battle and watch the men in the corner at the same time. He knew the highwayman was playing with him. He was ready to swallow his pride and call upon the corporal and soldiers to rush in and give him aid. And then there came a sudden battering at the door, which the native had bolted. The heart of Gonzales gave a great leap. Somebody was there, wishing to enter. Whoever it was would think it peculiar that the door was not thrown open instantly by the fat landlord or his servant. Perhaps help was at hand.
"We are interrupted, Señor,"
the highwayman said. "I regret it, for I will not have the time to give you the punishment you deserve, and will have to arrange to visit you another time. You scarcely are worth a double visit." The pounding at the door was louder now. Gonzales raised his voice.
"Ha! We have Señor Zorro here!"
"Poltroon!" the highwayman cried. His blade seemed to take on new life. It darted in and out with a speed that was bewildering. It caught 1,000 beams of light from the flickering candles and hurled them back. And suddenly it darted in and hooked itself properly, and Sergeant Gonzales felt his sword torn from his grasp and saw it go flying through the air.
"So!" Señor Zorro cried.
Gonzales awaited the stroke. A sob came into his throat that this must be the end, instead of on a field of battle where a soldier wishes it. But no steel entered his breast to bring forth his life's blood. Instead, Señor Zorro swung his left hand down, passed the hilt of his blade to it, and grasped it beside the pistol's butt, and with his right he slapped Pedro Gonzales once across the cheek.
"That for a man who mistreats helpless natives!" he cried.
Gonzales roared in rage and shame. Somebody was trying to smash the door in now, but Señor Zorro appeared to give it little thought. He sprang back, and sent his blade into its scabbard like a flash. He swept the pistol before him, and thus threatened all in the long room. He darted to a window, sprang upon a bench.
"Until a later time, Señor," he cried.
and then he went through the window as a mountain goat jumps from a cliff, taking its covering with him. In rushed the wind and rain, and the candles went out.
After him!
Gonzales screeched, springing across the room and grasping his blade again.
Unbar the door! Out and after him! Remember, there is a generous reward!
The corporal reached the door first and threw it open. In stumbled two men of the pueblo, eager for wine and an explanation of the fastened door. Sergeant Gonzales and his comrades drove over them, left them sprawling, and dashed into the storm. But there was little use in it. It was so dark a man could not see a distance of a horse's length. The beating rain was enough to obliterate tracks almost instantly. Señor Zorro was gone, and no man could tell in what direction. There was a tumult, of course, in which the men of the pueblo joined. Sergeant Gonzales and the soldiers returned to the inn to find it full of men they knew, and Sergeant Gonzales knew, also, that his reputation was now at stake.
Nobody but a highwayman, nobody but a cutthroat and thief would have done it, he cried aloud.
How is that, brave one? Cried a man in the throng near the doorway.
This pretty Señor Zorro knew, of course. Some days ago I broke the thumb of my sword hand while fencing at San Juan Capistrano. No doubt the word was passed to this Señor Zorro, and he visits me at such a time that he may afterward say he had vanquished me.
The corporal and soldiers and landlord stared at him, but none was brave enough to say a word.
Those who were here can tell you, señores, Gonzales went on. This Señor Zorro came in at the door and immediately drew a pistol, devil's weapon, from beneath his cloak. He presents it at us and forces all except me to retire to that corner. I refuse to retire. Then you shall fight me, says this pretty highwayman, and I draw my blade, thinking to make an end of the pest. And what does he tell me then? We shall fight, he says, and I will outpoint you, so that I may boast of it afterward. In my left hand I hold the pistol. If your attack is not to my liking, I shall fire, and afterward run you through, and so make an end of a certain sergeant. The corporal gasped, and the fat landlord was almost ready to speak, but thought better of it when Sergeant Gonzales glared at him. Could anything be more devilish? Gonzales asked. I was to fight, and yet I would get a devil's chunk of lead in my carcass if I pressed the attack. Was there ever such a farce? It shows the stuff of which this pretty highwayman is made. Some day I shall meet him when he holds no pistol, and then—
But how did he get away? Someone in the crowd asked.
He heard those at the door. He threatened me with the devil's pistol and forced me to toss my blade in yonder far corner. He threatened us all, ran to the window, and sprang through. And how could we find him in the darkness, or track him through the sheets of rain? But I am determined now. In the morning I go to my Captain Ramon and ask permission to be absolved from all other duty, that I may take some comrades and run down this pretty Señor Zorro. Ha! We shall go fox hunting. The excited crowd about the door suddenly parted, and Don Diego Vega hurried into the tavern.
What is this I hear? He asked. They are saying that Señor Zorro has paid a visit here.
"'Tis a true word, caballero," Gonzales answered, "and we were speaking of the cutthroat here this evening. Had you remained instead of going home to work with your secretary, you would have seen the entire affair."
Were you not here? Can you not tell me? Don Diego asked. But I pray you make not the tale too bloody. I cannot see why men must be violent. Where is the highwayman's dead body?
Gonzales choked. The fat landlord turned away to hide his smile.
The corporal and soldiers began picking up wine mugs to keep busy at this dangerous moment.
There is no body, Gonzales managed to say.
Have done with your modesty, Sergeant, Don Diego cried. Am I not your friend? Did you not promise to tell me the story if you met this cutthroat? I know you would spare my feelings, knowing that I do not love violence, Yet I am eager for the facts because you, my friend, have been engaged with this fellow. How much was the reward?"
"By the saints!" Gonzales swore.
"Come, sergeant, out with the tale. Landlord, give all of us wine that we may celebrate this affair. Your tale, sergeant. Shall you leave the army now that you have earned the reward, and purchase a hacienda and take a wife?" Sergeant Gonzales choked again, and reached gropingly for a wine mug. "You promised me," Don Diego continued, "that you would tell me the whole thing, word by word. Did he not say as much, landlord? You declared that you would relate how you played with him, how you laughed at him while you fought, how you pressed him back after a time and then ran him through."
"By the saints!" Sergeant Gonzales roared, the words coming from between his lips like peals of thunder. "It is beyond the endurance of any man! You, Don Diego, my friend!"
"Your modesty ill becomes you at such a time," Don Diego said. "You promised the tale, and I would have it. What does this Señor Zorro look like? Have you peered at the dead face beneath the mask? It is perhaps some man that we all know. Cannot some one of you tell me the facts? You stand here like so many speechless images of men."
"Wine, or I choke!" Gonzales howled. "Don Diego, you are my good friend, and I will cross swords with any man who belittles you. But do not try me too far this night."
"I fail to understand," Don Diego said. "I have but asked you to tell me the story of the fight, how you mocked him as you battled, how you pressed him back at will, and presently ended it by running him through."
"Enough! Am I to be taunted?"
the big sergeant cried. He gulped down the wine and hurled the mug far from him. "Is it possible that you did not win the battle?" Don Diego asked. "But surely this pretty highwayman could not stand up before you, my sergeant. How was the outcome?"
"He had a pistol."
"Why did you not take it away from him, then, and crowd it down his throat? But perhaps that is what you did. Here is more wine, my sergeant. Drink!" But Sergeant Gonzales was thrusting his way through the throng at the door.
"I must not forget my duty," he said. "I must hurry to the Presidio and report this occurrence to the Commandante."
"But, sergeant—"
"And as to this Señor Zorro, he will be meat for my blade before I am done," Gonzales promised. And then, cursing horribly, he rushed away through the rain, the first time in his life he had ever allowed duty to interfere with his pleasure and had run from good wine. Don Diego Vega smiled as he turned toward the fireplace. Chapter 5. A Ride in the Morning. The following morning found the storm at an end, and there was not a single cloud to mar the perfect blue of the sky, and the sun was bright, and palm fronds glistened in it, and the air was bracing as it blew down the valleys from the sea. At mid-morning, Don Diego Vega came from his house in the pueblo, drawing on his sheepskin riding mittens, and stood for a moment before it, glancing across the plaza at the little tavern. From the rear of the house an Indian servant led a horse. Though Don Diego did not go galloping across the hills and up and down El Camino Real like an idiot, yet he owned a fairish bit of horseflesh. The animal had spirit and speed and endurance, and many a young blood would have purchased him, except that Don Diego had no use for more money and wanted to retain the beast. The saddle was heavy, and showed more silver than leather on its surface. The bridle was heavily chased with silver, too, and from its sides dangled leather globes studded with semi-precious stones, that now glittered in the bright sunshine as if to advertise Don Diego's wealth and prestige to all the world. Don Diego mounted, while half a score of men loitering around the plaza watched, and made efforts to hide their grins. It was quite the thing in those days for a youngster to spring from the ground into his saddle, gather up the reins, rake the beast's flanks with his great spurs, and disappear in a cloud of dust all in one motion.
But Don Diego mounted a horse as he did everything else, without haste or spirit. The native held a stirrup, and Don Diego inserted the toe of his boot. Then he gathered the reins in one hand, pulled himself into the saddle as if it had been quite a task. Having done that much, the native held the other stirrup and guided Don Diego's other boot into it, and then he backed away, and Don Diego clucked to the magnificent beast and started it, at a walk, along the edge of the plaza toward the trail that ran to the north. Having reached the trail, Don Diego allowed the animal to trot, and after having covered a mile in this fashion, he urged the beast into a slow gallop, and so rode along the highway. Men were busy in the fields and orchards, and natives were tending the herds. Now and then Don Diego passed a lumbering carreta, and saluted whoever happened to be in it. Once a young man he knew passed him at a gallop, going toward the pueblo, and Don Diego stopped his own horse to brush the dust from his garments after the man had gone his way. Those same garments were more gorgeous than usual this bright morning. A glance at them was enough to establish the wealth and position of the wearer. Don Diego had dressed with much care, admonishing his servants because his newest serape was not pressed properly, and spending a great deal of time over the polishing of his boots. He travelled for a distance of 4 miles, and then turned from the high road and started up a narrow, dusty trail that led to a group of buildings against the side of a hill in the distance. Don Diego Vega was about to pay a visit to the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. This same Don Carlos had experienced numerous vicissitudes during the last few years. Once he had been second to none except Don Diego's father in position, wealth, and breeding. But he had made the mistake of getting on the wrong side of the fence politically, and he found himself stripped of a part of his broad acres, and tax-gatherers bothering him in the name of the governor, until there remained but a remnant of his former fortune, but all his inherited dignity of birth. On this morning Don Carlos was sitting on the veranda of the hacienda, meditating on the times, which were not at all to his liking. His wife, Doña Catalina, the sweetheart of his youth and age, was inside directing her servants. His only child, the Señorita Lolita, likewise was inside, plucking at the strings of a guitar, and dreaming as a girl of 18 dreams. Don Carlos raised his silvered head and peered down the long, twisting trail, and saw in the distance a small cloud of dust. The dust cloud told him that a single horseman was approaching, and Don Carlos feared another gatherer of taxes. He shaded his eyes with a hand and watched the approaching horseman carefully. He noted the leisurely manner in which he rode his mount, and suddenly hope sang in his breast, for he saw the sun flashing from the silver on saddle and bridle, and he knew that men of the army did not have such rich harness to use while on duty. The rider had made the last turning now, and was in plain sight from the veranda of the house, and Don Carlos rubbed his eyes and looked again to verify the suspicion he had. Even at that distance the aged Don could establish the identity of the horseman. "'Tis Don Diego Vega," he breathed. "May the saints grant that here is a turn in my fortunes for the better at last." Don Diego, he knew, might only be stopping to pay a friendly visit, and yet that would be something, for when it was known abroad that the Vega family was on excellent terms with the Pulido establishment, even the politicians would stop to think twice before harassing Don Carlos further, for the Vegas were a power in the land. So Don Carlos slapped his hands together, and a native hurried out from the house, and Don Carlos bade him draw the shades so that the sun would be kept from a corner of the veranda, and place a table and some chairs, and hurry with small cakes and wine. He sent word into the house to the women, too, that Don Diego Vega was approaching. Doña Catalina felt her heart beginning to sing, and she herself began to hum a little song, and Señorita Lolita ran to a window to look out at the trail. When Don Diego stopped before the steps that led to the veranda, there was a native waiting to care for his horse, and Don Carlos himself walked halfway down the steps and stood waiting, his hand held out in welcome. I am glad to see you a visitor at my poor hacienda, Don Diego," he said, as the young man approached, drawing off his mittens. "It is a long and dusty road," Don Diego said. "It wearies me, too, to ride a horse the distance." Don Carlos almost forgot himself and smiled at that, for surely riding a horse a distance of 4 miles was not enough to tire a young man of blood. But he remembered Don Diego's lifelessness and did not smile, lest the smile cause anger. He led the way to the shady nook on the veranda, and offered Don Diego wine and cakes, and waited for his guest to speak. As became the times, the women remained inside the house, not ready to show themselves unless the visitor asked for them, or their lord and master called. "How are things in the pueblo of Reina de los Angeles?" Don Carlos asked. "It has been a space of several score days since I visited there." "Everything is the same," said Don Diego, "except that this Señor Zorro invaded the tavern last evening and had a duel with the big Sergeant Gonzales." "Ha! Señor Zorro, eh? And what was the outcome of the fighting?" "Though the sergeant has a crooked tongue while speaking of it," said Don Diego, "it has come to me through a corporal who was present that this Señor Zorro played with the sergeant, and finally disarmed him and sprang through a window to make his escape in the rain. They could not find his tracks." "A clever rogue," Don Carlos said. "At least, I have nothing to fear from him. It is generally known up and down El Camino Real, I suppose, that I have been stripped of almost everything the governor's men could carry away. I look for them to take the hacienda next." Such a thing should be stopped," Don Diego said, with more than his usual amount of spirit. The eyes of Don Carlos brightened. If Don Diego Vega could be made to feel some sympathy, if one of the illustrious Vega family would but whisper a word in the governor's ear, the persecution would cease instantly, for the commands of a Vega were made to be obeyed by all men of whatever rank. Chapter 6. Diego Seeks a Bride. Don Diego sipped his wine slowly and looked out across the mesa, and Don Carlos looked at him in puzzled fashion, realizing that something was coming, and scarcely knowing what to expect. "I did not ride through the damnable sun and dust to talk with you concerning this Señor Zorro, or any other bandit," Don Diego explained after a time. "Whatever your errand, I am glad to welcome one of your family, caballero," Don Carlos said. "I had a long talk with my father yesterday morning," Don Diego went on. "He informed me that I am approaching the age of 25, and he is of a mind that I am not accepting my duties and responsibilities in the proper fashion." "But surely—" "Oh, doubtless he knows. My father is a wise man." "And no man can dispute that, Don Diego." "He urged upon me that I awaken and do as I should. I have been dreaming, it appears. A man of my wealth and station—you will pardon me if I speak of it—must do certain things." "It is the curse of position, signor." "When my father dies, I come into his fortune, naturally, being the only child. That part of it is all right. But what will happen when I die? That is what my father asks." "I understand." "A young man of my age, he told me, should have a wife, a mistress of his household, and should have offspring to inherit and preserve an illustrious name." "Nothing could be truer than that," said Don Carlos. "So I have decided to get me a wife." "Ha! It is something every man should do, Don Diego. Well do I remember when I courted Dona Catalina. We were mad to get into each other's arms, but her father kept her from me for a time. I was only 17, though, so perhaps he did right. But you are nearly 25. Get you a bride by all means." "And so I have come to see you about it," Don Diego said. "To see me about it!" gasped Don Carlos, with something of fear and a great deal of hope in his breast. It will be rather a bore, I expect. Love and marriage and all that sort of thing is rather a necessary nuisance in its way. The idea of a man of sense running about a woman, playing a guitar for her, making up to her like a loon when everyone knows his intention, and then the ceremony. Being a man of wealth and station, I suppose the wedding must be an elaborate one, and the natives will have to be feasted and all that, simply because a man is taking a wife to be mistress of his household.
Most young men,
Don Carlos observed, delight to win a woman and are proud if they have a great and fashionable wedding. No doubt. But it is an awful nuisance. However, I will go through with it, Signor. It is my father's wish, you see. You, if you will pardon me again, have fallen upon evil days. That is the result of politics, of course. But you are of excellent blood, Signor, of the best blood in the land.
I thank you for remembering that truth, said Don Carlos, rising long enough to put one hand over his heart and bow.
Everyone knows it, Signor. And a Vega, naturally, when he takes a mate, must seek out a woman of excellent blood.
To be sure, Don Carlos exclaimed.
You have an only daughter, the Señorita Lolita.
Yes indeed, Signor. Lolita is 18 now, and a beautiful and accomplished girl, if her father is the man to say it.
I have observed her at the mission and at the pueblo, Don Diego said. She is indeed beautiful, and I have heard that she is accomplished. Of her birth and breeding there can be no doubt. I think she would be a fit woman to preside over my household.
Signor.
That is the object of my visit today, Signor. You are asking my permission to pay addresses to my fair daughter? I am, Signor.
Don Carlos' face beamed, and again he sprang from his chair, this time to bend forward and grasp Don Diego by the hand. She is a fair flower, the father said. I would see her wed, and I have been to some anxiety about it, for I did not wish her to marry into a family that did not rank with mine. But there can be no question where a Vega is concerned. You have my permission, Signor. Don Carlos was delighted. An alliance between his daughter and Don Diego Vega. His fortunes were retrieved the moment that was consummated. He would be important and powerful again. He called a native and sent for his wife, and within a few minutes the Doña Catalina appeared on the veranda to greet the visitor, her face beaming, for she had been listening. Don Diego has done us the honour to request permission to pay his respects to our daughter, Don Carlos explained.
You have given consent? Doña Catalina asked, for it would not do, of course, to jump for the man.
I have given my consent, Don Carlos replied.
Doña Catalina held out her hand, and Don Diego gave it a languid grasp and then released it. Such an alliance would be a proud one, Doña Catalina said. I hope that you may win her heart, Signor. As to that, said Don Diego, I trust there will be no undue nonsense. Either the lady wants me and will have me, or she will not. Will I change her mind if I play a guitar beneath her window, or hold her hand when I may, or put my hand over my heart and sigh? I want her for wife, else I would not have ridden here to ask her father for her.
Of course, said Don Carlos.
Ah, Signor, but a maid delights to be won, said the Doña Catalina. It is her privilege, Signor. The hours of courtship are held in memory during her lifetime. She remembers the pretty things her lover said, and the first kiss, when they stood beside the stream and looked into each other's eyes, and when he showed sudden fear for her, when they were riding and her horse bolted. Those things, Signor. It is like a little game, and it has been played since the beginning of time. Foolish, Signor? Perhaps, when a person looks at it with cold reason, but delightful, nevertheless. I don't know anything about it, Don Diego protested. I never ran around making love to women." "The woman you marry will not be sorry because of that, señor." "You think it is necessary for me to do these things?" "Oh," said Don Carlos, afraid of losing an influential son-in-law, "a little bit would not hurt. A maid likes to be wooed, of course, even though she has made up her mind." "I have a servant who is a wonder at the guitar," Don Diego said. "Tonight I shall order him to come out and play beneath the señorita's window." "And not come yourself?" Doña Catalina gasped. "Ride out here again tonight, when the chill wind blows in from the sea?" gasped Don Diego. "It would kill me. And the native plays the guitar better than I." "I, I never heard of such a thing," Doña Catalina gasped, her sense of the fitness of things outraged. "Let Don Diego do as he wills," Don Carlos urged. "I had thought," said Don Diego, "that you would arrange everything and let me know. I would have my house put in order, of course, and get me more servants. Perhaps I should purchase a coach and drive with my bride as far as Santa Barbara and visit a friend there. Is it not possible for you to attend to everything else? Just merely send me word when the wedding is to be." Don Carlos Pulido was nettled a little himself now. "Caballero," he said, "when I courted Doña Catalina, she kept me on needles and pins. One day she would frown, and the next day smile. It added a spice to the affair. I would not have it different. You will regret it, señor, if you do not do your own courting. Would you like to see the señorita now?" "I suppose I must," Don Diego said. Doña Catalina threw up her head and went into the house to fetch the girl. And soon she came, a dainty little thing with black eyes that snapped, and black hair that was wound around her head in a great coil, and dainty little feet that peeped from beneath skirts of bright hue. "I am happy to see you again, Don Diego," she said. He bowed over her hand and assisted her to one of the chairs. "You are as beautiful as you were when I saw you last," he said. "Always tell a señorita that she is more beautiful than when you saw her last," groaned Don Carlos. "Ah, that I were young again and could make love anew." He excused himself and entered the house, and Doña Catalina moved to the other end of the veranda, so that the pair could talk without letting her hear the words, but from where she could watch, as a good duenna always must. "Señorita," Don Diego said, "I have asked your father this morning for permission to seek you in marriage." "Oh, señor!" the girl gasped. "Do you think I would make a proper husband?" "Why, that is—" "Just say the word, señorita, and I shall tell my father, and your family will make arrangements for the ceremony. They can send word in to me by some native. It fatigues me to ride abroad when it is not at all necessary." Now the pretty eyes of the Señorita Lolita began flashing warning signals, but Don Diego, it was evident, did not see them, and so he rushed forward to his destruction. "Shall you agree to becoming my wife, señorita?" he asked, bending slightly toward her. Señorita Lolita's face burned red, and she sprang from her chair, her tiny fists clenched at her side. "Don Diego Vega," she replied, "you are of noble family, and have much wealth, and will inherit more, but you are lifeless, señor. Is this your idea of courtship and romance? Can you not take the trouble to ride 4 miles on a smooth road to see the maid you would wed? What sort of blood is in your veins, señor?" Doña Catalina heard that, and now she rushed across the veranda toward them, making signals to her daughter, which Señorita Lolita refused to see. "The man who weds me must woo me and win my love," the girl went on. "He must touch my heart. Think you that I am some bronze native wench to give myself to the first man who asks? The man who becomes my husband must be a man with life enough in him to want me. Send your servant to play a guitar beneath my window? Oh, I heard, senor. Send him, senor, and I'll throw boiling water upon him and bleach his red skin. Buenos dias, senor. She threw up her head proudly, lifted her silken skirts aside, and so passed him to enter the house, disregarding her mother also. Dona Catalina moaned once for her lost hopes. Don Diego Vega looked after the disappearing señorita and scratched at his head thoughtfully, and glanced toward his horse. I believe she is displeased with me, he said in his timid voice. Chapter 7. A Different Sort of Man. Don Carlos lost no time in hurrying out to the veranda again, since he had been listening and so knew what had happened, and endeavouring to placate the embarrassed Don Diego Vega. Though there was consternation in his heart, he contrived to chuckle and make light of the occurrence.
Women are fitful and filled with fancy, senor, he said. At times they will rail at those whom they in reality adore. There is no telling the workings of a woman's mind. She cannot explain it with satisfaction herself.
But I scarcely understand, Don Diego gasped. I used my words with care. Surely I said nothing to insult or anger the señorita?
She would be wooed, I take it, in the regular fashion. Do not despair, senor. Both her mother and myself have agreed that you are a proper man for her husband. It is customary that a maid fight off a man to a certain extent, and then surrender. It appears to make the surrender the sweeter. Perhaps the next time you visit us she will be more agreeable. I feel quite sure of it.
So Don Diego shook hands with Don Carlos Pulido, and mounted his horse and rode slowly down the trail. And Don Carlos turned about and entered his house again, and faced his wife and daughter, standing before the latter with his hands on his hips and regarding her with something akin to sorrow. "He is the greatest catch in all the country," Dona Catalina was wailing, and she dabbed at her eyes with a delicate square of filmy lace.
"He has wealth and position, and could mend my broken fortunes if he were but my son-in-law,"
Don Carlos declared, not taking his eyes from his daughter's face. "He has a magnificent house, and a hacienda besides, and the best horses near Reina de los Angeles, and he is sole heir to his wealthy father," Dona Catalina said.
"One whisper from his lips into the ear of His Excellency the Governor, and a man is made or unmade," added Don Carlos.
"He is handsome, I grant you that," exclaimed the Señorita Lolita, lifting her pretty head and glaring at them bravely. "That is what angers me. What a lover the man could be if he would. Is it anything to make a girl proud to have it said that the man she married never looked at another woman, and so did not select her after dancing and talking and playing at love with others?"
"He preferred you to all others, else he would not have ridden out today," Don Carlos said.
"Certainly it must have fatigued him," the girl said. "Why does he let himself be made the laughing-stock of the country? He is handsome and rich and talented. He has health and could lead all the other young men. Yet he has scarcely enough energy to dress himself, I doubt not." "This is all beyond me," the Dona Catalina wailed. "When I was a girl there was nothing like this. An honourable man comes seeking you as wife. Were he less honourable and more of a man, I might look at him a second time," said the señorita.
"You must look at him more than a second time," put in Don Carlos, with some authority in his manner. "You cannot throw away such a fine chance. Think on it, my daughter. Be in a more amiable mood when Don Diego calls again."
Then he hurried to the patio on pretence that he wished to speak to a servant, but in reality to get away from the scene. Don Carlos had proved himself to be a courageous man in his youth, and now he was a wise man also, and hence he knew better than to participate in an argument between women. Soon the siesta hour was at hand, and the Señorita Lolita went into the patio and settled herself on a little bench near the fountain. Her father was dozing on the veranda, and her mother in her room, and the servants were scattered over the place, sleeping also. But Señorita Lolita could not sleep, for her mind was busy. She knew her father's circumstances, of course, for it had been some time since he could hide them, and she wanted, naturally, to see him in excellent fortune again. She knew, too, that did she wed with Don Diego Vega, her father was made whole, for a Vega would not let the relatives of his wife be in any but the best of circumstances. She called up before her a vision of Don Diego's handsome face, and wondered what it would be like if lighted with love and passion. "'Twere a pity the man was so lifeless," she told herself, "but to wed a man who suggested sending a native servant to serenade her in his own place." The splashing of the water in the fountain lulled her to sleep, and she curled up on one end of the bench, her cheek pillowed on one tiny hand, her black hair cascading to the ground. And suddenly she was awakened by a touch on her arm, and sat up quickly, and then would have screamed except that a hand was crushed against her lips to prevent her. Before her stood a man whose body was enveloped in a long cloak, and whose face was covered with a black mask, so that she could see nothing of his features except his glittering eyes. She had heard Señor Zorro, the highwayman, described, and she guessed that this was he, and her heart almost ceased to beat, she was so afraid. "Silence, and no harm comes to you, Señorita," the man whispered hoarsely. You are?" she questioned on her breath. He stepped back, removed his sombrero, and bowed low before her. "You have guessed it, my charming Señorita," he said. "I am known as Señor Zorro, the curse of Capistrano." "And you are here—"
"I mean you no harm. No harm to any of this hacienda, Señorita. I punish those who are unjust, and your father is not that. I admire him greatly. Rather would I punish those who do him evil than to touch him."
I thank you, señor."
"I am weary, and the hacienda is an excellent place to rest," he said. "I knew it to be the siesta hour also, and thought every one would be asleep. It were a shame to awaken you, Señorita, but I felt that I must speak. Your beauty would hinge a man's tongue in its middle, so that both ends might be free to sing your praises." Señorita Lolita had the grace to blush.
"I would that my beauty affected other men so," she said.
"And does it not? Is it that the Señorita Lolita lacks suitors? But that cannot be possible."
"It is, nevertheless, señor. There are few bold enough to seek to ally themselves with the family of Pulido, since it is out of favour with the powers. There is one suitor," she went on, "but he does not seem to put much life into his wooing."
"Ha! A laggard at love, and in your presence. What ails the man? Is he ill?"
"He is so wealthy that I suppose he thinks he has but to request it, and a maiden will agree to wed him."
"What an imbecile! 'Tis the wooing gives the spice to romance."
"But you, señor, somebody may come and see you here. You may be captured."
"And do you not wish to see a highwayman captured? Perhaps it would mend your father's fortune were he to capture me. The governor is much vexed, I understand, concerning my operations."
You had best go," she said.
"There speaks mercy in your heart. You know that capture would mean my death. Yet must I risk it and tarry a while."
He seated himself upon the bench, and Señorita Lolita moved away as far as she could, and then started to rise. But Señor Zorro had been anticipating that. He grasped one of her hands, and before she guessed his intention, had bent forward, raised the bottom of his mask, and pressed his lips to its pink, moist palm. "Signor!" she cried, and jerked her hand away. "It were bold, yet a man must express his feelings," he said. "I have not offended beyond forgiveness, I hope." "Go, signor, else I make an outcry." "And get me executed?"
"You are but a thief of the high road."
"Yet I love life as any other man."
"I shall call out, signor. There is a reward offered for your capture."
"Such pretty hands would not handle blood money."
"Go!"
"Ah, señorita, you are cruel. A sight of you sends the blood pounding through a man's veins. A man would fight a horde at the bidding of your sweet lips."
"Signor!"
"A man would die in your defence, señorita. Such grace, such fresh beauty."
"For the last time, signor, I shall make an outcry, and your fate be on your own head."
"Your hand again, and I go."
"It may not be."
"Then here I sit until they come and take me. No doubt I shall not have to wait long. That big Sergeant Gonzales is on the trail, I understand, and may have discovered track of me. He will have soldiers with him."
"Signor, for the love of the saints!"
"Your hand." She turned her back and gave it, and once more he pressed his lips to the palm, and then she felt herself being turned slowly, and her eyes looked deep into his. A thrill seemed to run through her. She realized that he retained her hand, and she pulled it away. And then she turned and ran quickly across the patio and into the house. With her heart pounding at her ribs, she stood behind the curtains at a window and watched. Señor Zorro walked slowly to the fountain and stooped to drink. Then he put his sombrero on, looked once at the house, and stalked away. She heard the galloping hoofs of a horse die in the distance.
"A thief, yet a man," she breathed. "If Don Diego had only half as much dash and courage."
Chapter 8 Don Carlos Plays a Game. She turned away from the window, thankful that none of the household had seen Señor Zorro or knew of his visit. The remainder of the day she spent on the veranda, half the time working on some lace she was making, and the other half gazing down the dusty trail that ran toward the highway. And then came evening, and down by the natives' adobe huts big fires were lighted, and the natives gathered around them to cook and eat and speak of the events of the day. Inside the house the evening meal had been prepared, and the family was about to sit at table, when someone knocked upon the door. An Indian ran to open it, and Señor Zorro strode into the room. His sombrero came off, he bowed, and then he raised his head and looked at the speechless Doña Catalina and the half-terrified Don Carlos. "I trust you will pardon this intrusion," he said. "I am the man known as Señor Zorro. But do not be frightened, for I have not come to rob." Don Carlos got slowly upon his feet, while Señorita Lolita gasped at this display of the man's courage, and feared he would mention the visit of the afternoon, of which she had refrained from telling her mother.
"Scoundrel!" Don Carlos roared. "You dare to enter an honest house?"
"I am no enemy of yours, Don Carlos," Señor Zorro replied. "In fact, I have done some things that should appeal to a man who has been persecuted." That was true, Don Carlos knew, but he was too wise to admit it and so speak treason. Heaven knew he was enough in the bad graces of the governor now, without offending him more by treating with courtesy this man for whose carcass the governor had offered a reward.
"What do you wish here?"
he asked. "I crave your hospitality, señor. In other words, I would eat and drink. I am a caballero, hence make my claim in justice."
"Whatever good blood once flowed in your veins has been fouled by your actions," Don Carlos said. "A thief and highwayman has no claim upon the hospitality of this hacienda."
"I take it that you fear to feed me, since the governor may hear of it," Señor Zorro answered. You may say that you were forced to do it, and that will be the truth." Now one hand came from beneath the cloak, and it held a pistol. Dona Catalina shrieked and fainted, and Señorita Lolita cowered in her chair.
"Doubly a scoundrel, since you frighten women!"
Don Carlos exclaimed angrily.
"Since it is death to refuse, you may have meat and drink. But I ask you to be caballero enough to allow me to remove my wife to another room and call a native woman to care for her."
"By all means," Señor Zorro said. "But the señorita remains here as hostage for your good conduct and return." Don Carlos glanced at the man and then at the girl, and saw that the latter was not afraid. He picked his wife up in his arms and bore her through the doorway, roaring for servants to come. Señor Zorro walked around the end of the table, bowed to Lolita again, and sat down in a chair beside her. "This is foolhardiness, no doubt, but I had to see your beaming face again," he said.
"Señor!"
"The sight of you this afternoon started a conflagration in my heart, señorita. The touch of your hand was new life to me." Lolita turned away, her face flaming, and Señor Zorro moved his chair nearer and reached for her hand, but she eluded him. "The longing to hear the music of your voice, señorita, may lure me here often," he said.
"Señor, you must never come again. I was lenient with you this afternoon, but I cannot be again. The next time I shall shriek, and you will be taken."
"You could not be so cruel," he said.
"Your fate would be upon your own head, señor."
Then Don Carlos came back into the room, and Señor Zorro arose and bowed once more. "I trust your wife has recovered from her swoon," he said. "I regret that the sight of my poor pistol frightened her."
"She has recovered," Don Carlos said. "I believe you said that you wished meat and drink. Now that I come to think of it, señor, you have indeed done some things that I have admired, and I am happy to grant you hospitality for a time. A servant shall furnish you food immediately."
Don Carlos walked to the door, called a native, and gave his orders. Don Carlos was well pleased with himself. Carrying his wife into the next room had given him his chance, for servants had answered his call, and among them had been one he trusted, and he had ordered the man to take the swiftest horse and ride like the wind the 4 miles to the pueblo, and there to spread the alarm that Señor Zorro was at the Pulida hacienda. His object now was to delay this Señor Zorro as much as possible, for he knew the soldiers would come, and the highwayman be killed or captured, and surely the governor would admit that Don Carlos was entitled to some consideration for what he had done.
"You must have had some stirring adventure, señor," Don Carlos said, as he returned to the table.
"A few," the highwayman admitted.
"There was that affair at Santa Barbara, for instance. I never did hear the straight of that."
"I dislike to speak of my own work, señor."
"Please,"
the señorita Lolita begged, and so Señor Zorro overcame his scruples for the time being.
"It really was nothing," he said. "I arrived in the vicinity of Santa Barbara at sunset. There is a fellow there who runs a store, and he had been beating natives and stealing from the frailes. He would demand that the frailes sell him goods from the mission, and then complain that the weight was short, and the governor's men would make the frailes deliver more. So I resolved to punish the man."
"Pray continue, señor," said Don Carlos, bending forward as if deeply interested.
"I dismounted at the door of his building and walked inside. He had candles burning, and there were half a dozen fellows trading with him. I covered them with my pistol and drove them into a corner, and ordered the storekeeper before me. I frightened him thoroughly, and forced him to disgorge the money he had in a secret hiding place, and then I lashed him with a whip taken from his own wall, and told him why I had done it.
"Excellent!" Don Carlos cried. Then I sprang on my horse and dashed away. At a native's hut I made a placard saying that I was a friend of the oppressed. Feeling particularly bold that evening, I galloped up to the door of the Presidio, brushed aside the sentry, who took me for a courier, and pinned the placard to the door of the Presidio with my knife. Just then the soldiers came rushing out. I fired over their heads, and while they were bewildered, I rode away toward the hills. "And escaped!" Don Carlos exclaimed. "I am here. That is your answer." "And why is the governor so particularly bitter against you, señor?" Don Carlos asked. "There are other highwaymen to whom he gives not a thought." "Ha! I had a personal clash with His Excellency. He was driving from San Francisco de Assis to Santa Barbara on official business, with an escort of soldiers about him. They stopped at a brook to refresh themselves, and the soldiers scattered while the governor spoke with his friends. I was hiding in the forest, and suddenly dashed out and at them. Instantly I was at the open door of the coach. I presented my pistol at his head, and ordered him to hand over his fat purse, which he did. Then I spurred through his soldiers, upsetting several as I did so. "And escaped!" Don Carlos cried. "I am here," assented Señor Zorro. The servant brought a tray of food and placed it before the highwayman, retreating as soon as possible, his eyes big with fear and his hands trembling, for many weird tales had been told of this same Señor Zorro and his brutality, none of which was true. "I am sure that you will pardon me," Señor Zorro said, "when I ask you to sit at the far end of the room. As I take each bite, I must raise the bottom of my mask, for I have no wish to become known. I put the pistol before me on the table, so, to discourage treachery. And now, Don Carlos Pulido, I shall do justice to the meal you have furnished." Don Carlos and his daughter sat where they had been directed, and the bandit ate with evident relish. Now and then he stopped to talk to them, and once he had Don Carlos send out for more wine, declaring it to be the best he had tasted for a year. Don Carlos was only too glad to oblige him. He was playing to gain time. He knew the horse the native rode, and judged that he had reached the Presidio at Reina de los Angeles before this, and that the soldiers were on their way. If he could hold this Señor Zorro until they arrived— "I am having some food prepared for you to carry with you, señor," he said. "You will pardon me while I get it? My daughter will entertain you." Señor Zorro bowed, and Don Carlos hurried from the room. But Don Carlos had made a mistake in his eagerness. It was an unusual thing for a girl to be left alone in the company of a man in such fashion, especially with a man known to be an outlaw. Señor Zorro guessed at once that he was being delayed purposely. For again, it was an unusual thing for a man like Don Carlos to go for the package of food himself, when there were servants that could be called by a mere clapping of the hands. Don Carlos, in fact, had gone into the other room to listen at a window for sounds of galloping horses. "Señor," Lolita whispered across the room. "What is it, señorita?" "You must go at once. I am afraid that my father has sent for the soldiers." "And you are kind enough to warn me?" "Do I wish to see you taken here? Do I wish to see fighting and bloodshed?" she asked. "That is the only reason, señorita?" "Will you not go, señor?" "I am loath to rush away from such a charming presence, señorita. May I come again at the next siesta hour?" "By the saints, no! This must end, Señor Zorro. Go your way, and take care. You have done some things that I admire, hence I would not see you captured. Go north as far as San Francisco de Assis, and turn honest, señor. It is the better way." "Little priest," he said.
"Shall you go, señor?"
"But your father has gone to fetch food for me, and could I depart without thanking him for this meal?" Don Carlos came back into the room then, and Señor Zorro knew by the expression on his face that the soldiers were coming up the trail. The Don put a package on the table. "Some food to carry with you, señor," he said, and we would relish more of your reminiscences before you start on your perilous journey. I have spoken too much of myself already, signor, and it ill becomes a caballero to do that. It were better that I thank you and leave you now. At least, signor, drink another mug of wine. I fear, said Señor Zorro, that the soldiers are much too close, Don Carlos. The face of the Don went white at that, for the highwayman was picking up his pistol, and Don Carlos feared he was about to pay the price for his treacherous hospitality. But Señor Zorro made no move to fire. I forgive you this breach of hospitality, Don Carlos, because I am an outlaw and there has been a price put upon my head, he said. And also I hold you no ill will because of it. Buenas noches, señorita. Señor, adios. Then a terrified servant who knew little concerning the events of the evening rushed in at the door.
Master, the soldiers are here, he cried. They are surrounding the house.
Chapter 9. The Clash of Blades. On the table, near its middle, was an imposing candelero in which half a score of candles burned brightly. Señor Zorro sprang toward it now, and with one sweep of his hand dashed it to the floor, extinguishing all the candles in an instant, and plunging the room in darkness. He evaded the wild rush of Don Carlos, springing across the room so lightly that his soft boots made not the slightest noise to give news of his whereabouts. For an instant the Señorita Lolita felt a man's arm around her waist, gently squeezing it, felt a man's breath on her cheek, and heard a man's whisper in her ear. Until later, señorita. Don Carlos was bellowing like a bull to direct the soldiers to the scene, and already some of them were pounding at the front door. Señor Zorro rushed from the room and into the one adjoining, which happened to be the kitchen. The native servants fled before him as if he had been a ghost, and he quickly extinguished all the candles that burned there. Then he ran to the door that opened into the patio, and raised his voice, and gave a call that was half moan and half shriek, a peculiar call, the like of which none at the Pulido hacienda had heard before. As the soldiers rushed in at the front door, and as Don Carlos called for a brand with which to light the candles again, the sound of galloping hoofs was heard from the rear of the patio. Some powerful horse was getting under way there, the soldiers guessed immediately. The sound of hoofs died away in the distance, but the soldiers had noted the direction in which the horse was travelling. "The fiend escapes!" Sergeant Gonzalez shrieked, he being in charge of the squad. "To horse, and after him! I give the man who overtakes him 1/3 of all the reward." The big sergeant rushed from the house, the men at his heels, and they tumbled into their saddles and rode furiously through the darkness, following the sound of the beating hoofs. "Lights! Lights!" Don Carlos was shrieking inside the house. A servant came with a brand, and the candles were lighted again. Don Carlos stood in the middle of the room, shaking his fists in impotent rage. Señorita Lolita crouched in a corner, her eyes wide with fear. Doña Catalina, fully recovered now from her fainting spell, came from her own room to ascertain the cause of the commotion. "The rascal got away," Don Carlos said. "It is to be hoped that the soldiers capture him."
"At least he is clever and brave," Señorita Lolita said.
"I grant him that, but he is a highwayman and a thief," Don Carlos roared. "Why should he torment me by visiting my house?"
Señorita Lolita thought she knew, but she would be the last one to explain to her parents. There was a faint blush on her face, yet, because of the arm that had squeezed her and the words that had been whispered in her ear. Don Carlos threw the front door open wide and stood in it, listening. To his ears came the sound of galloping hoofs once more. "My sword!" he cried to a servant. "Someone comes. It may be the rascal returning. It is but one rider, by the saints!" The galloping stopped. A man made his way across the veranda and hurried through the door into the room. "Thank the good saints!" Don Carlos gasped. It was not the highwayman returned. It was Captain Ramon, Comandante of the Presidio at Reina de los Angeles. "Where are my men?" the captain cried.
Gone, senor. Gone after that pig of a highwayman, Don Carlos informed him.
He escaped?
He did, with your men surrounding the house. He dashed the candles to the floor, ran through the kitchen.
The men took after him?
They are upon his heels, senor.
Ha! It is to be hoped that they catch this pretty bird. He is a thorn in the side of the soldiery. We do not catch him, and because we do not, the governor sends sarcastic letters by his courier. This Señor Zorro is a clever gentleman, but he will be captured yet. And then Captain Ramon walked further into the room, and perceived the ladies, and swept off his cap and bowed before them. You must pardon my bold entrance, he said. When an officer is on duty— The pardon is granted freely, said Dona Catalina. You have met my daughter? I have not had the honour. The Dona presented them, and Lolita retreated to her corner again and observed the soldier. He was not ill to look at, tall and straight and in a brilliant uniform, and with sword dangling at his side. As for the captain, he never had set eyes upon Señorita Lolita before, for he had been at the post at Reina de los Angeles but a month, having been transferred there from Santa Barbara. But now that he had looked at her once, he looked a second time, and a third. There was a sudden light in his eyes that pleased Dona Catalina. If Lolita could not look with favour upon Don Diego Vega, perhaps she would look with favour upon this Captain Ramon, and to have her wedded to an officer would mean that the Pulido family would have some protection. I could not find my men now in the darkness, the captain said, and so, if it is not presuming too much, I shall remain here and await their return.
By all means, Don Carlos said. Be seated, senor, and I'll have the servant fetch wine.
This Señor Zorro has about had his run, the captain said, after the wine had been tasted and found excellent. Now and then a man of his sort pops up and endures for a little day, but he never lasts long. In the end he meets his fate.
That is true, said Don Carlos. The fellow was boasting to us tonight of his accomplishments.
I was commandante at Santa Barbara when he made his famous visit there, the captain explained. I was visiting at one of the houses at the time, else there might have been a different story. And tonight, when the alarm came, I was not at the Presidio, but at the residence of a friend. That is why I did not ride out with the soldiers. As soon as I was notified, I came. It appears that Señor Zorro has some knowledge of my whereabouts, and is careful that I am not in a position to clash with him. I hope one day to do so. You think you could conquer him, senor? Dona Catalina asked. Undoubtedly. I understand he really is an ordinary hand with a blade. He made a fool of my sergeant, but that is a different proposition. And I believe he held a pistol in one hand while he fenced, too. I should make short work of the fellow. There was a closet in one corner of the room, and now its door was opened a crack. The fellow should die the death, Captain Ramon went on to say. He is brutal in his dealings with men. He kills wantonly, I have heard. They say he caused a reign of terror in the north, in the vicinity of San Francisco de Assis. He slew men regardless, insulted women. The closet door was hurled open, and Señor Zorro stepped into the room.
I shall take you to task for that statement, senor, since it is a falsehood,
the highwayman cried. Don Carlos whirled around and gasped his surprise. Dona Catalina felt suddenly weak in the knees and collapsed on a chair. Señorita Lolita felt some pride in the man's statement and a great deal of fear for him.
I thought you had escaped, Don Carlos gasped.
Ha! It was but a trick. My horse escaped, but I did not. Then there shall be no escape for you now, Captain Ramon cried, drawing his blade.
Back, senor,
Zorro cried, exhibiting a pistol suddenly.
I shall fight you gladly, but the fight must be fair.
Don Carlos, gather your wife and daughter beneath your arms, and retire to the corner while I cross blades with this teller of falsehoods. I do not intend to have a warning given out that I still am here."
"I thought you escaped."
Don Carlos gasped again, seemingly unable to think of anything else, and doing as Signor Zorro commanded.
"A trick," the highwayman repeated, laughing. "It is a noble horse I have. Perhaps you heard a peculiar cry from my lips? My beast is trained to act at that cry. He gallops away wildly, making considerable noise, and the soldiers follow him. And when he has gone some distance, he turns aside and stops, and after the pursuit has passed, he returns to await my bidding. No doubt he is behind the patio now. I shall punish this captain, and then mount and ride away." "With a pistol in your hand?" Ramon cried. "I put the pistol upon the table, so. There it remains if Don Carlos stays in the corner with the ladies. Now, captain."
Signor Zorro extended his blade, and with a glad cry, Captain Ramon crossed it with his own. Captain Ramon had some reputation as a master of fence, and Signor Zorro evidently knew it, for he was cautious at first, leaving no opening, on defence rather than attack. The captain pressed him back, his blade flashing like streaks of lightning in a troubled sky. Now Signor Zorro was almost against the wall near the kitchen door, and in the captain's eyes the light of triumph already was beginning to burn. He fenced rapidly, giving the highwayman no rest, standing his ground and keeping his antagonist against the wall. And then Signor Zorro chuckled. For now he had solved the other's manner of combat, and knew that all would be well. The captain gave ground a little as the defence turned into an attack that puzzled him. Signor Zorro began laughing lightly.
"'Twere a shame to kill you," he said. "You are an excellent officer, I have heard, and the army needs a few such. But you have spoken falsehood regarding me, and so must pay a price. Presently I shall run you through, but in such manner that your life will not emerge when I withdraw my blade." "Boaster!" the captain snarled. "As to that, we shall see presently. Ha! Ha! I almost had you there, my captain. You are more clever than your big sergeant, but not half clever enough. Where do you prefer to be touched, the left side or the right?" "If you are so certain, run me through the right shoulder," the captain said. "Guard it well, my captain, for I shall do as you say. Ha!" The captain circled, trying to get the light of the candles in the highwayman's eyes, but Signor Zorro was too clever for that. He caused the captain to circle back, forced him to retreat, fought him to a corner. "Now, my captain!" he cried. And so he ran him through the right shoulder, as the captain had said, and twisted the blade a bit as he brought it out. He had struck a little low, and Captain Ramon dropped to the floor, a sudden weakness upon him. Signor Zorro stepped back and sheathed his blade. "I ask the pardon of the ladies for this scene," he said, "and I assure you that this time I am indeed going away. You will find that the captain is not badly injured, Don Carlos. He may return to his presidio within the day." He removed his sombrero and bowed low before them, while Don Carlos sputtered and failed to think of anything to say that would be mean and cutting enough. His eyes for a moment met those of the Señorita Lolita, and he was glad to find that in hers there was no repugnance. "Buenas noches," he said, and laughed again. And then he dashed through the kitchen and into the patio, and found the horse awaiting him there, as he had said it would be, and was quick to mount and ride away. Chapter 10. A Hint at Jealousy. Within the space of half an hour, Captain Ramon's wounded shoulder had been cleansed of blood and bandaged, and the captain was sitting at one end of the table, sipping wine and looking very white in the face and tired. Dona Catalina and Señorita Lolita had shown much sympathy, though the latter could scarcely refrain from smiling when she remembered the captain's boast regarding what he purposed doing to the highwayman, and compared it to what had happened. Don Carlos was outdoing himself to make the captain feel at home, since it was well to seek influence with the army, and already had urged upon the officer that he remained at the hacienda a few days until his wound had healed.
Having looked into the eyes of the Señorita Lolita, the captain had answered that he would be glad to remain at least for a day, and despite his wound was attempting polite and witty conversation, yet failing miserably. Once more there could be heard the drumming of a horse's hoofs, and Don Carlos sent a servant to the door to open it so that the light would shine out, for they supposed that it was one of the soldiers returning. The horseman came nearer, and presently stopped before the house, and the servant hurried out to care for the beast. There passed a moment during which those inside the house heard nothing at all, and then there were steps on the veranda, and Don Diego Vega hurried through the door. "Ha!" he cried, as if in relief. "I am rejoiced that you all are alive and well."
Don Diego,
the master of the house exclaimed,
you have ridden out from the pueblo a second time in one day.
"No doubt I shall be ill because of it," Don Diego said. "Already I am feeling stiff and my back aches, yet I felt that I must come. There was an alarm in the pueblo, and it was noised abroad that this Señor Zorro, the highwayman, had paid a visit to the hacienda. I saw the soldiers ride furiously in this direction, and fear came into my heart. You understand, Don Carlos, I feel sure."
I understand, caballero.
Don Carlos replied, beaming upon him and glancing once at Señorita Lolita.
"I felt it my duty to make the journey, and now I find that it has been made for naught. You all are alive and well. How does it happen?"
Lolita sniffed, but Don Carlos was quick to make reply.
The fellow was here, but he made his escape after running Captain Ramon through the shoulder.
"Ha!"
Don Diego said, collapsing into a chair.
"So you have felt his steel, eh, Captain? That should feed your desire for vengeance. Your soldiers are after the rogue?"
"They are," the captain replied shortly, for he did not like to have it said that he had been defeated in combat.
"And they will continue to be after him until he is captured. I have a big sergeant, Gonzales. I think he is a friend of yours, Don Diego, who is eager to make the arrest and earn the governor's reward. I shall instruct him, when he returns, to take his squad and pursue this highwayman until he has been dealt with properly. Let me express the hope that the soldiers will be successful, senor. The rogue has annoyed Don Carlos and the ladies, and Don Carlos is my friend. I would have all men know it."
Don Carlos beamed, and Dona Catalina smiled bewitchingly, but the Señorita Lolita fought to keep her pretty upper lip from curling with scorn.
"A mug of your refreshing wine, Don Carlos,"
Don Diego Vega continued.
"I am fatigued. Twice today have I ridden here from Reina de los Angeles, and it is about all a man can endure."
"'Tis not much of a journey, 4 miles," said the captain.
"Possibly not for a rough soldier," Don Diego replied, "but it is for a caballero."
"May not a soldier be a caballero?" Ramon asked, nettled somewhat at the other's words.
"It has happened before now, but we come across it rarely," Don Diego said. He glanced at Lolita as he spoke, intending that she should take notice of his words, for he had seen the manner in which the captain glanced at her, and jealousy was beginning to burn in his heart.
"Do you mean to insinuate, senor, that I am not of good blood?" Captain Ramon asked.
"I cannot reply as to that, senor, having seen none of it. No doubt the Señor Zorro could tell me. He saw the colour of it, I understand."
"By the saints!" Captain Ramon cried. "You would taunt me?"
"Never be taunted by the truth," Don Diego observed. "He ran you through the shoulder, eh? 'Tis a mere scratch, I doubt not. Should you not be at the Presidio, instructing your soldiers?"
"I await their return here," the captain replied. "Also, it is a fatiguing journey from here to the Presidio, according to your own ideas, senor."
"But a soldier is inured to hardship, senor."
"True, but there are many pests he must encounter," the captain said, glancing at Don Diego with meaning.
"You term me a pest, senor?"
"Did I say as much?" This was perilous ground, and Don Carlos had no mind to let an officer of the army and Don Diego Vega have trouble in his hacienda, for fear he would get into greater difficulties.
More wine, señores,
He exclaimed in a loud voice, and stepping between their chairs in utter disregard of proper breeding.
Drink, my captain, for your wound has made you weak. And you, Don Diego, after your wild ride.
I doubt its wildness, Captain Ramon observed. Don Diego accepted the proffered wine mug and turned his back upon the captain. He glanced across at Señorita Lolita and smiled. He got up deliberately and picked up his chair, and carried it across the room to set it down beside her. "And did the rogue frighten you, Señorita?" he asked. "Suppose he did, Señor. Would you avenge the matter? Would you put blade at your side and ride abroad until you found him, and then punish him as he deserves?" "By the saints, were it necessary, I might do as much. But I am able to employ a raft of strong fellows who would like nothing better than to run down the rogue. Why should I risk my own neck?" "Oh!" she exclaimed, exasperated. "Let us not talk further of this bloodthirsty Señor Zorro," he begged. "There are other things fit for a conversation. Have you been thinking, Señorita, on the subject of my visit earlier in the day?" Señorita Lolita thought of it now. She remembered again what the marriage would mean to her parents and their fortunes, and she recalled the highwayman too, and remembered his dash and spirit, and wished that Don Diego could be such a man. And she could not say the word that would make her the betrothed of Don Diego Vega. I have scarcely had time to think of it, caballero," she replied. "I trust you will make up your mind soon," he said. "You are so eager?" "My father was at me again this afternoon. He insists that I should take a wife as soon as possible. It is rather a nuisance, of course, but a man must please his father." Lolita bit her lips because of her quick anger. Was ever girl so courted before, she wondered? "I shall make up my mind as soon as possible, señor," she said finally. "Does this Captain Ramon remain long at the hacienda?" A little hope came into Lolita's breast. Could it be possible that Don Diego Vega was jealous? If that were true, possibly there might be stuff in the man after all. Perhaps he would awaken, and love and passion come to him, and he would be as other young men. "My father has asked him to remain until he is able to travel to the Presidio," she replied. "He is able to travel now. A mere scratch." "You will not return tonight?" she asked. "It probably will make me ill, but I must return. There are certain things that must engage my interest early in the morning. Business is such a nuisance." "Perhaps my father will offer to send you in the carriage." "Ha! It were kindness if he does. A man may doze a bit in a carriage." "But if this highwayman should stop you?" "I need not fear, señorita. Have I not wealth? Could I not purchase my release?" "You would pay ransom rather than fight him, señor?" "I have lots of money, but only one life, señorita. Would I be a wise man to risk having my blood let out?" "It would be the manly part, would it not?" she asked. "Any male can be manly at times, but it takes a clever man to be sagacious," he said. Don Diego laughed lightly, as if it cost him an effort, and bent forward to speak in lower tones. On the other side of the room, Don Carlos was doing his best to make Captain Ramon comfortable, and was glad that he and Don Diego remained apart for the time being. "Don Carlos," the captain said, "I come from a good family, and the governor is friendly toward me, as no doubt you have heard. I am but 23 years of age, else I would hold a higher office. But my future is assured." "I am rejoiced to learn it, señor." "I never set eyes upon your daughter until this evening, but she has captivated me, señor. Never have I seen such grace and beauty, such flashing eyes. I ask your permission, señor, to pay my addresses to the señorita." Chapter 11. Three Suitors. Here was a fix. Don Carlos had no wish to anger Don Diego Vega or a man who stood high in the governor's regard. And how was he to evade it? If Lolita could not force her heart to accept Don Diego, perhaps she could learn to love Captain Ramon. After Don Diego, he was the best potential son-in-law in the vicinity. "Your answer, señor?" the captain was asking.
"I trust you will not misunderstand me, señor," Don Carlos said in lower tones. "I must make a simple explanation."
"Proceed, señor."
"But this morning Don Diego Vega asked me the same question."
"Ha!"
"You know his blood and his family, señor. Could I refuse him? Of rights I could not. But I may tell you this. The señorita weds no man unless it is her wish. So Don Diego Vega has my permission to pay his addresses, but if he fails to touch her heart—"
"Then I may try?" the captain asked.
"You have my permission, señor. Of course, Don Diego has great wealth, but you have a dashing way with you, and Don Diego, that is, he is rather—"
"I understand perfectly, señor," the captain said, laughing. "He is not exactly a brave and dashing caballero. Unless your daughter prefers wealth to a genuine man—"
"My daughter will follow the dictates of her heart, señor," Don Carlos said proudly.
"Then the affair is between Don Diego Vega and myself?"
"So long as you use discretion, señor. I would have nothing happen that would cause enmity between the Vega family and mine."
"Your interests shall be protected, Don Carlos," Captain Ramon declared. As Don Diego talked, the Señorita Lolita observed her father and Captain Ramon, and guessed what was being said. It pleased her, of course, that a dashing officer should enter the lists for her hand, and yet she had felt no thrill when first she looked into his eyes. Señor Zorro, now, had thrilled her to the tips of her tiny toes, and merely because he had talked to her and touched the palm of her hand with his lips. If Don Diego Vega were only more like the highwayman, if some man appeared who combined Vega's wealth with the rogue's spirit and dashing courage! There was a sudden tumult outside, and into the room strode the soldiers, Sergeant Gonzalez at their head. They saluted their captain, and the big sergeant looked with wonder at his wounded shoulder.
"The rogue escaped us," Gonzalez reported. "We followed him for a distance of 3 miles or so, as he made his way into the hills, where we came upon him."
"Well?" Ramon questioned.
"He has allies."
"What is this?"
"Fully 10 men were waiting for him there, my captain. They set upon us before we were aware of their presence. We fought them well, and 3 of them we wounded, but they made their escape and took their comrades with them. We had not been expecting a band, of course, and so rode into their ambush."
"Then we have to contend with a band of them," Captain Ramon said. "Sergeant, you will select a score of men in the morning, and have command over them. You will take the trail of the Señor Zorro, and you will not stop until he is either captured or slain. I will add a quarter's wages to the reward of His Excellency, the Governor, if you are successful."
"Ah! It is what I have wished!" Sergeant Gonzalez cried. "Now we shall run this coyote to earth in short order. I shall show you the colour of his blood."
"'Twould be no more than right, since he has seen the colour of the captain's," Don Diego put in.
"What is this, Don Diego, my friend? Captain, you have crossed blades with the rogue?"
"I have," the captain assented. "You but followed a tricky horse, my sergeant. The fellow was here, in a closet, and came out after I had entered. So it must have been some other man you met with his companions up in the hills. This Señor Zorro treated me much as he treated you in the tavern. had a pistol handy in case I should prove too expert with the blade." Captain and sergeant looked at each other squarely, each wondering how much the other had been lying, while Don Diego chuckled faintly and tried to press the Señorita Lolita's hand, and failed.
"This thing can only be settled in blood," Gonzales declared. "I shall pursue the rascal until he is run to earth. I have permission to select my men?"
"You may take any at the Presidio," the captain said.
"Sergeant Gonzales, I should like to go with you,"
Don Diego said suddenly.
"By the saints, it would kill you, caballero. Day and night in saddle, uphill and downhill, through dust and heat, and with a chance at fighting."
"Well, perhaps it were best for me to remain in the pueblo," Don Diego admitted. "But he has annoyed this family, of which I am a true friend. At least you will keep me informed? You will tell me how he escapes if he dodges you? I at least may know that you are on his trail and where you are riding, so I may be with you in spirit?"
"Certainly, caballero, certainly,"
Sergeant Gonzales replied.
"I shall give you the chance of looking upon the rogue's dead face. I swear it."
"'Tis a terrible oath, my sergeant. Suppose it should come to pass."
"I mean, if I slay the rascal, caballero. My captain, do you return this night to the Presidio?"
"Yes," Ramon replied. "Despite my wound, I can ride a horse." He glanced toward Don Diego as he spoke, and there was almost a sneer upon his lips.
"What magnificent grit!" Don Diego said. "I too shall return to Reina de los Angeles, if Don Carlos will be as good as to have his carriage around. I can tie my horse to the rear of it. To ride horseback the distance again this day would be the death of me."
Gonzales laughed and led the way from the house. Captain Ramon paid his respects to the ladies, glowered at Don Diego, and followed. The caballero faced Señorita Lolita again as her parents escorted the captain to the door.
"You will think of the matter?" he asked. "My father will be at me again within a few days, and I shall escape censure if I am able to tell him that it is all settled. If you decide to wed me, have your father send me word by a servant. Then I shall put my house in order against the wedding day." "I shall think of it," the girl said. "We could be married at the mission of San Gabriel, only we should have to make the confounded journey there. Fray Felipe of the mission has been my friend from the days of my boyhood, and I would have him say the words, unless you prefer otherwise. He could come to Reina de los Angeles and read the ceremony in the little church on the plaza there." "I shall think of it," the girl said again. "Perhaps I may come out again to see you within a few days, if I survive this night. Buenas noches, señorita. I suppose I should, kiss your hand?" "You need not take the trouble," Señorita Lolita replied. "It might fatigue you." "Ah, thank you. You are thoughtful, I see. I am fortunate if I get me a thoughtful wife."
Don Diego sauntered to the door. Señorita Lolita rushed into her own room and beat at her breasts with her hands, and tore at her hair a bit, too angry, too enraged to weep. Kiss her hand, indeed! Señor Zorro had not suggested it. He had done it. Señor Zorro had dared death to visit her. Señor Zorro had laughed as he fought, and then had escaped by a trick. Ah, if Don Diego Vega were half the man the highwayman appeared! She heard the soldiers gallop away, and after a little time she heard Don Diego Vega depart in her father's carriage, and then she went out into the great room again to her parents.
"My father, it is impossible that I wed with Don Diego Vega," she said.
"What has caused your decision, my daughter?"
"I scarcely can tell, except that he is not the sort of man I wish for my husband. He is lifeless. Existence with him would be a continual torment." Captain Ramon also has asked permission to pay you his addresses, Dona Catalina said. And he is almost as bad. I do not like the look in his eyes, the girl replied.
You are too particular, Don Carlos told her. If the persecution continues another year, we shall be beggars. Here is the best catch in the country seeking you, and you would refuse him. And you do not like a high army officer because you do not fancy the look in his eyes. Think on it, girl. An alliance with Don Diego Vega is much to be desired. Perhaps, when you know him better, you will like him more, and the man may awaken. I thought I saw a flash of it this night, deemed him jealous because of the presence of the captain here. If you can arouse his jealousy—" Señorita Lolita burst into tears, but soon the tempest of weeping passed, and she dried her eyes. I shall do my best to like him, she said, but I cannot bring myself to say yet that I will be his wife. She hurried into her room again and called for the native woman who attended her. Soon the house was in darkness, and the grounds about it, save for the fires down by the adobe huts, where the natives told one another grim tales of the night's events, each trying to make his falsehood the greatest. A gentle snore came from the apartment of Don Carlos Pulido and his wife. But the Señorita Lolita did not slumber. She had her head propped on one hand, and she was looking through a window at the fires in the distance, and her mind was full of thoughts of Señor Zorro. She remembered the grace of his bow, the music of his deep voice, the touch of his lips upon her palm.
I would he were not a rogue, she sighed. How a woman could love such a man.
Chapter 12. A Visit. Shortly after daybreak the following morning there was considerable tumult in the plaza at Reina de los Angeles. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez was there with a score of troopers, almost all that were stationed at the local presidio, and they were preparing for the chase of Señor Zorro. The big sergeant's voice roared out above the din as men adjusted saddles and looked to bridles and inspected their water bottles and small supplies of provisions. For Sergeant Gonzalez had ordered that his force travel light and live off the country as much as possible. He had taken the commands of his captain seriously. He was going after Señor Zorro and did not propose to return until he had him, or had died in an effort to effect a capture.
I shall nail the fellow's pelt to the presidio door, my friend, he told the fat landlord. Then I shall collect the governor's reward and pay the score I owe you.
I pray the saints it may be true, the landlord said.
What, fool, that I pay you? Do you fear to lose a few small coins?
I meant that I pray you may be successful in capturing the man, the landlord said, telling the falsehood glibly. Captain Ramon was not up to see the start, having a small fever because of his wound, but the people of the pueblo crowded around Sergeant Gonzalez and his men, asking a multitude of questions, and the sergeant found himself the center of interest.
This curse of Capistrano soon shall cease to exist, he boasted loudly. Pedro Gonzalez is on his trail. Ha! When I stand face to face with the fellow.
The front door of Don Diego Vega's house opened at that juncture, and Don Diego himself appeared, at which the townsmen wondered a bit, since it was so early in the morning. Sergeant Gonzalez dropped the bundle he was handling, put his hands upon his hips, and looked at his friend with sudden interest.
You have not been to bed, he charged.
But I have, Don Diego declared.
And are up again so soon? Here is some devilish mystery that needs an explanation.
You made noise enough to awaken the dead, Don Diego said.
It could not be helped, caballero, since we are acting under orders.
Were it not possible to make your preparations at the presidio instead of here in the plaza? Or did you think not enough persons would see your importance there?
Now, by the—
Do not say it, Don Diego commanded. As a matter of fact, I am up early because I must make a confounded trip to my hacienda, a journey of some 10 miles, to inspect the flocks and herds. Never become a wealthy man, Sergeant Gonzales, for wealth asks too much of a man.
Something tells me that never shall I suffer on that account, said the sergeant, laughing. You go with escort, my friend?
A couple of natives, that is all.
If you should meet up with this Señor Zorro, he probably would hold you for a pretty ransom.
Is he supposed to be between this place and my hacienda? Don Diego asked.
A native arrived a short time ago with word that he had been seen on the road running to Pala and San Luis Rey. We ride in that direction, and since your hacienda is the other way, no doubt you will not meet the rascal now.
I feel somewhat relieved to hear you say it. So you ride toward Pala, my sergeant?
We do. We shall try to pick up his trail as soon as possible, and once we have it, we shall run this fox down. Meanwhile, we also shall attempt to find his den. We start at once.
I shall await news eagerly, Don Diego said. Good fortune go with you. Gonzales and his men mounted, and the sergeant shouted an order, and they galloped across the plaza, raising great clouds of dust, and took the highway toward Pala and San Luis Rey. Don Diego looked after them until nothing could be seen but a tiny dust cloud in the distance, then called for his own horse. He, too, mounted and rode away toward San Gabriel, and 2 native servants rode mules and followed a short distance behind. But before he departed, Don Diego wrote a message and sent it by native courier to the Pulido hacienda. It was addressed to Don Carlos and read, The soldiers are starting this morning to pursue this Señor Zorro, and it has been reported that the highwayman has a band of rogues under his command and may offer battle. There is no telling, my friend, what may happen. I dislike having one in whom I am interested subjected to danger, meaning your daughter particularly, but also the Doña Catalina and yourself. Moreover, this bandit saw your daughter last evening, and certainly must have appreciated her beauty, and he may seek to see her again. I beg of you to come at once to my house in Reina de los Angeles, and make it as your home until matters are settled. I am leaving this morning for my hacienda, but have left orders with my servants that you are to give what commands you will. I shall hope to see you when I return, which will be in 2 or 3 days. Signed, Diego. Don Carlos read that epistle aloud to his wife and daughter, and then looked up to see how they took it. He scoffed at the danger himself, being an old war horse, but did not wish to put his womenfolk in jeopardy.
What think you?
He asked. It has been some time since we have visited the pueblo, Doña Catalina said. I have some friends left among the ladies there. I think it will be an excellent thing to do.
It certainly will not injure our fortunes to have it become known we are house guests of Don Diego Vega, Don Carlos said. What does our daughter think?
It was a concession to ask her, and Lolita realized that she was granted this unusual favor because of Don Diego's wooing. She hesitated some time before answering. I believe it will be all right, she said. I should like to visit the pueblo, for we see scarcely anybody here at the hacienda, but people may talk concerning Don Diego and myself.
Nonsense! Don Carlos exploded. Could there be anything more natural than that we should visit the Vegas, since our blood is almost as good as theirs and better than that of others?
But it is Don Diego's house and not that of his father. Still, he will not be there for 2 or 3 days, he says, and we can return when he comes.
Then it is settled, Don Carlos declared. I shall see my superintendent and give him instructions.
He hurried into the patio and rang the big bell for the superintendent, being well pleased. for when the Señorita Lolita saw the rich furnishings in the house of Don Diego Vega, she might the more readily accept Don Diego as a husband, he thought. When she saw the silks and satins, the elegant tapestries, the furniture inlaid with gold and studded with precious stones, when she realized that she could be mistress of this and much more besides, Don Carlos flattered himself that he knew the feminine heart. Soon after the siesta hour, a carreta was brought before the door, drawn by mules and driven by a native. Dona Catalina and Lolita got into it, and Don Carlos bestrode his best horse and rode at its side. And so they went down the trail to the highway, and down the highway toward Reina de los Angeles. They passed folk who marveled to see the Pulido family thus going abroad, for it was well known that they had met with ill fortune and scarcely went anywhere now. It was even whispered that the ladies did not keep up with the fashions, and that the servants were poorly fed, but remained at the hacienda because their master was so kind. But Dona Catalina and her daughter held their heads proudly, as did Don Carlos, and they greeted the people they knew, and so continued along the highway. Presently they made a turning and could see the pueblo in the distance, the plaza and the church with its high cross on one side of it, and the inn and storehouses, and a few residences of the more pretentious sort, like Don Diego's, and the scattered huts of natives and poor folk. The carreta stopped before Don Diego's door, and servants rushed out to make the guests welcome, spreading a carpet from the carreta to the doorway, that the ladies would not have to step in the dust. Don Carlos led the way into the house, after ordering that the horse and mules be cared for and the carreta put away, and there they rested for a time, and the servants brought out wine and food. They went through the rich house then, and even the eyes of Dona Catalina, who had seen many rich houses, widened at what she saw here in Don Diego's home. "To think that our daughter can be mistress of all this when she speaks the word!" she gasped. Señorita Lolita said nothing, but she began thinking that perhaps it would not be so bad after all to become the wife of Don Diego. She was fighting a mental battle, was Señorita Lolita. On the one side was wealth and position, and the safety and good fortune of her parents, and a lifeless man for husband. And on the other side was the romance and ideal love she craved. Until the last hope was gone, she could not give the latter up. Don Carlos left the house and crossed the plaza to the inn, where he met several gentlemen of age, and renewed acquaintance with them, albeit he noticed that none were enthusiastic in his greeting. They feared, he supposed, to appear openly friendly to him, since he was in the bad graces of the governor. "You are in the pueblo on business?" one asked.
"Not so, señor,"
Don Carlos replied, and gladly, since here was a chance to set himself right in part.
"This Señor Zorro is abroad, and the soldiers after him."
"We are aware of that."
"There may be a battle, or a series of raids, since it is whispered that now Señor Zorro has a band of cutthroats with him, and my hacienda is off by itself and would be at the mercy of the thief."
"Ah, and so you bring your family to the pueblo until the matter is at an end?"
"I had not thought of doing so, but this morning Don Diego Vega sent out to me a request that I bring my family here and make use of his house for the time being. Don Diego has gone to his hacienda, but will return within a short time."
The eyes of those who heard opened a bit at that, but Don Carlos pretended not to notice, and went on sipping his wine.
"Don Diego was out to visit me yesterday morning," he continued. "We renewed old times, and my hacienda had a visit from the Señor Zorro last night, as doubtless you have heard, and Don Diego, learning of it, galloped out again, fearing we had met with disaster."
"Twice in one day!" gasped one of those who heard.
"I have said it, señor."
That is, your daughter is very beautiful, is she not, Don Carlos Pulido? And 17, is she not? About.
18, señor. She is called beautiful, I believe.
Don Carlos admitted. Those around him glanced at one another. They had the solution now. Don Diego Vega was seeking to wed Señorita Lolita Pulido. That meant that Pulido's fortunes would soon be at the flood again, and that he might feel called upon to remember his friends and look askance at those who had not stood by him. So now they crowded forward, alert to do him honour, and asked concerning crops and the increase of his herds and flocks, and whether the bees were doing as well as usual, and did he think the olives were excellent this year. Don Carlos appeared to take it all as a matter of course. He accepted the wine they bought and purchased himself, and the fat landlord darted about doing their bidding and trying to compute the day's profits in his head, which was a hopeless task for him. When Don Carlos left the inn at dusk, several of them followed him to the door, and two of the more influential walked with him across the plaza to the door of Don Diego's house. One of these begged that Don Carlos and his wife visit his house that evening for music and talk, and Don Carlos graciously accepted the invitation. Doña Catalina had been watching from a window, and her face was beaming when she met her husband at the door. "Everything goes well," he said. "They have met me with open arms, and I have accepted an invitation to visit tonight."
"But Lolita," Doña Catalina protested.
"She must remain here, of course. Will it not be all right? There are 100 servants about, and I have accepted the invitation, my dear."
Such a chance to win favour again could not be disregarded, of course, and so Lolita was made acquainted with the arrangement. She was to remain in the great living room, reading a volume of verse she had found there, and if she grew sleepy she was to retire to a certain chamber. The servants would guard her, and the despensero would look after her wishes personally. Don Carlos and his wife went to make their evening visit, being lighted across the plaza by half a dozen natives who held torches in their hands, for the night was without a moon and rain was threatening again. Señorita Lolita curled up on the couch, the volume of verse in her lap, and began to read. Each verse treated of love, romance, passion. She marvelled that Don Diego would read such, being so lifeless himself, but the volume showed that it had been much handled. She sprang from the couch to look at other books on a bench not far away, and her amazement increased. Volume after volume of poets who sang of love, volumes that had to do with horsemanship, books that had been written at the dictation of masters of fence, tales of great generals and warriors were there. Surely these volumes were not for a man of Don Diego's blood, she told herself. And then she thought that perhaps he revelled in them, though not in the manner of life they preached. Don Diego was something of a puzzle, she told herself for the 100th time, and she went back and began reading the poetry again. Then Captain Ramon hammered at the front door. Chapter 13. Love Comes Swiftly. The despensero hurried to open it.
"I regret that Don Diego is not at home, señor," he said. "He is gone to his hacienda."
"I know as much. Don Carlos and wife and daughter are here, are they not?"
"Don Carlos and his wife are out on a visit this evening, señor."
The señorita
is here, of course."
"In that case, I shall pay my respects to the señorita," Captain Ramon said.
"Señor, pardon me, but the little lady is alone."
"Am I not a proper man?" the captain demanded.
It is scarcely right for her to receive the visit of a gentleman when her duenna is not present."
"Who are you to speak to me of the proprieties?" Captain Ramon demanded. "Out of my way, scum! Cross me, and you shall be punished. I know things concerning you." The face of the despensero went white at that, for the captain spoke the truth, and at a word could cause him considerable trouble and mayhap a turn in carcel. Yet he knew what was right.
"But, señor," he protested.
Captain Ramon thrust him aside with his left arm and stalked into the big living room. Lolita sprang up in alarm when she saw him standing before her. "Ah, señorita, I trust that I did not startle you," he said. "I regret that your parents are absent, yet must have a few words with you. This servant would deny me entrance, but I imagine you have naught to fear from a man with one wounded arm." "It is scarcely proper, is it, señor?" the girl asked, a bit frightened. "I feel sure no harm can come of it," he said. He went across the room and sat down on one end of the couch, and admired her beauty frankly. The despensero hovered near. "Go to your kitchen, fellow," Captain Ramon commanded. "No, allow him to remain," Lolita begged. "My father commanded it, and he courts trouble if he leaves." "And if he remains, go, fellow." The servant went. Captain Ramon turned toward the girl again, and smiled upon her. He flattered himself that he knew women. They loved to see a man show mastery over other men. "More beautiful than ever, señorita," he said in a purring voice. "I really am glad to find you thus alone, for there is something I would say to you." "What can that be, señor?" "Last night at your father's hacienda I asked his permission to pay my addresses to you. Your beauty has inflamed my heart, señorita, and I would have you for my wife. Your father consented, except that he said Don Diego Vega also had received permission. So it appears that it lies between Don Diego and myself." "Should you speak of it, señor?" she asked. "Certainly Don Diego Vega is not the man for you," he went on. "Has he courage, spirit? Is he not a laughing-stock because of his weakness?" "You speak ill of him in his own house?" the señorita asked, her eyes flashing. "I speak the truth, señorita. I would have your favour. Can you not look upon me with kindness? Can you not give me hope that I may win your heart and hand?" "Captain Ramon, all this is unworthy," she said. "It is not the proper manner, and you know it. I beg you to leave me now." "I await your answer, señorita." Her outraged pride rose up at that. Why could she not be wooed as other señoritas in the proper fashion? Why was this man so bold in his words? Why did he disregard the conventions? "You must leave me," she said firmly. "This is all wrong, and you are aware of it. Would you make my name a byword, Captain Ramon? Suppose somebody was to come and find us like this, alone." "Nobody will come, señorita. Can you not give me an answer?"
"No!" she cried, starting to get to her feet. "It is not right that you should ask it. My father, I assure you, shall hear of this visit."
"Your father!" he sneered. "A man who has the ill will of the governor. A man who is being plucked because he possessed no political sense. I fear not your father. He should be proud of the fact that Captain Ramon looks at his daughter."
"Señor!"
"Do not run away," he said, clutching her hand. "I have done you the honour to ask you to be my wife."
"Done me the honour!" she cried angrily and almost in tears. "It is the man who is done the honour when a woman accepts him."
"I like you when you rage," he observed. "Sit down again, beside me, here, and now give me your answer."
"Señor!"
"You will wed me, of course. I shall intercede with the governor for your father and get a part of his estate restored. I shall take you to San Francisco de Asís, to the governor's house, where you will be admired by persons of rank."
"Señor, let me go."
"My answer, señorita. You have held me off enough." She wrenched away from him, confronted him with blazing eyes, her tiny hands clenched at her sides.
"Wed with you?" she cried. "Rather would I remain a maid all my life. Rather would I wed with a native. Rather would I die than wed with you. I wed a caballero, a gentleman, or no man, and I cannot say that you are such."
Pretty words from the daughter of a man who is about ruined.
"Ruin would not change the blood of the Politos, señor. I doubt whether you understand that. evidently having ill blood yourself. Don Diego shall hear of this. He is my father's friend."
"And you would wed the rich Don Diego, eh, and straighten out your father's affairs? You would not wed an honorable soldier, but would sell yourself?"
"Señor!"
she shrieked. This was beyond endurance. She was alone, there was nobody near to resent the insult, so her blood called upon her to avenge it herself. Like a flash of lightning, her hand went forward and came against Captain Ramon's cheek with a crack. Then she sprang backward, but he grasped her by an arm and drew her toward him. "I shall take a kiss to pay for that," he said. "Such a tiny bit of womanhood can be handled with one arm, thank the saints." She fought him, striking and scratching at his breast, for she could not reach his face. But he only laughed at her, and held her tighter until she was almost spent and breathless, and finally he threw back her head and looked down into her eyes. "A kiss in payment, señorita," he said. "It will be a pleasure to tame such a wild one." She tried to fight again, but could not. She called upon the saints to aid her, and Captain Ramon laughed more and bent his head and his lips came close to hers. But he never claimed the kiss. She started to wrench away from him again, and he was forced to strengthen his arm and pull her forward. And from a corner of the room there came a voice that was at once deep and stern.
"One moment, señor,"
it said. Captain Ramon released the girl and whirled on one heel. He blinked his eyes to pierce the gloom of the corner. He heard Señorita Lolita give a glad cry. Then Captain Ramon, disregarding the presence of the lady, cursed once and loudly, for Señor Zorro stood before him. He did not pretend to know how the highwayman had entered the house. He did not stop to think of it. He realized that he was without a blade at his side, and that he could not use it had he one, because of his wounded shoulder. And Señor Zorro was walking toward him from the corner.
"Outlaw I may be, but I respect women,"
the curse of Capistrano said.
"And you, an officer of the army, do not, it appears. What are you doing here, Captain Ramon?"
"And what do you here?"
"I heard a lady scream, which is warrant enough for a caballero to enter any place, señor. It appears to me that you have broken all the conventions."
"Perhaps the lady has broken them also."
"Señor!" roared the highwayman. "Another thought like that, and I cut you down where you stand, though you are a wounded man. How shall I punish you?"
"Dispensero! Natives!" the captain shouted suddenly. "Here is Señor Zorro! A reward if you take him!"
The masked man laughed. "'Twill do you small good to call for help," he said. "Spend your breath in saying your prayers, rather."
"You do well to threaten a wounded man."
"You deserve death, señor, but I suppose I must allow you to escape that. But you will go down upon your knees and apologize to this señorita, and then you will go from this house, slink from it like the cur you are, and keep your mouth closed regarding what has transpired here. If you do not, I promise to soil my blade with your life's blood. Ha! On your knees, señor, and instantly!" Señor Zorro commanded. "I have no time to waste in waiting. I am an officer. On your knees!" commanded Señor Zorro again, in a terrible voice. He sprang forward and grasped Captain Ramon by his well shoulder and threw him to the floor. "Quickly, poltroon! Tell the señorita that you humbly beg her pardon, which she will not grant, of course, since you are beneath speaking to, and that you will not annoy her again. Say it, or by the saints you have made your last speech." Captain Ramon said it. And then Señor Zorro grasped him by the neck and lifted him, and propelled him to the door, and hurled him into the darkness. And had his boots not been soft, Captain Ramon would have been injured more deeply, both in feelings and anatomy. Señor Zorro closed the door as the dispensero came running into the room, to stare in fright at the masked man. "Señorita, I trust that I have been of service," the highwayman said. "That scoundrel will not bother you further, else he feels the sting of my blade again."
"Oh, thank you, señor, thank you!" she cried. "I shall tell my father this good deed you have done. Despensero, get him wine."
There was naught for the butler to do except obey, since she had voiced the order, and he hurried from the room, pondering on the times and the manners. Señorita Lolita stepped to the man's side. "Señor," she breathed, "you saved me from insult. You saved me from the pollution of that man's lips. Señor, though you deem me unmaidenly, I offer you freely the kiss he would have taken." She put up her face and closed her eyes. "And I shall not look when you raise your mask," she said.
"It were too much, señorita," he said. "Your hand, but not your lips."
"You shame me, señor. I was bold to offer it, and you have refused."
"You shall feel no shame," he said.
He bent swiftly, raised the bottom of his mask, and touched lightly her lips with his.
"Ah, señorita," he said, "I would I were an honest man and could claim you openly. My heart is filled with love of you."
"And mine with love of you."
"This is madness. None must know."
"I would not fear to tell the world, señor."
"Your father and his fortunes, Don Diego."
"I love you, señor."
"Your chance to be a great lady. Do you think I did not know Don Diego was the man you meant when we spoke in your father's patio? This is a whim, señorita."
"It is love, señor, whether anything comes of it or not. And Ippolito does not love twice."
"What possibly could come of it but distress?"
"We shall see. God is good."
"It is madness."
"Sweet madness, señor."
He clasped her to him and bent his head again, and again she closed her eyes and took his kiss, only this time the kiss was longer. She made no effort to see his face.
"I may be ugly,"
he said.
"But I love you."
"Disfigured, señorita."
"Still I love you."
"What hope can we have?"
"Go, señor, before my parents return. I shall say nothing except that you saved me from insult, and then went your way again. They will think that you came to rob Don Diego. And turn honest, señor, for my sake. Turn honest, I say, and claim me. No man knows your face, and if you take off your mask forever, none ever will know your guilt. It is not as if you were an ordinary thief. I know why you have stolen. To avenge the helpless, to punish cruel politicians, to aid the oppressed. I know that you have given what you have stolen to the poor. Oh, señor."
"But my task is not yet done, señorita, and I feel called upon to finish it."
"Then finish it, and may the saints guard you, as I feel sure they will, and when it is finished, come back to me. I shall know you in whatever garb you come."
"Nor shall I wait that long, señorita. I shall see you often. I could not exist else."
"Guard yourself."
"I shall in truth now, since I have double reason. Life never was so sweet as now."
He backed away from her slowly. He turned and glanced toward a window near at hand.
"I must go," he said. "I cannot wait for the wine."
"That was but a subterfuge so that we could be alone," she confessed.
"Until the next time, señorita, and may it not be long."
"On guard, señor."
"Always, loved one. Señorita, adios."
Again their eyes met, and then he waved his hand at her, gathered his cloak close about his body, darted to the window and went through it. The darkness outside swallowed him. Chapter 14. Captain Ramon Writes a Letter. Picking himself up out of the dust before Don Diego Vega's door, Captain Ramon darted through the darkness to the footpath that ran up the slope toward the Presidio. His blood was aflame with rage, his face was purple with wrath. There remained at the Presidio no more than half a dozen soldiers, for the greater part of the garrison had gone with Sergeant Gonzales, and of these half dozen 4 were on the sick list and 2 were necessary as guards. So Captain Ramon could not send men down to the Vega house in an effort to effect a capture of the highwayman. Moreover, he decided that Señor Zorro would not remain there more than a few minutes, but would mount his horse and ride away, for the highwayman had a name for not resting long in one place. Besides, Captain Ramon had no wish to let it become known that this Señor Zorro had met him a second time and had treated him much like a peon. Could he give out the information that he had insulted a señorita, and that Señor Zorro had punished him because of it? That Señor Zorro had caused him to get down upon his knees and apologize, and then had kicked him through the front door like a dog? The captain decided it were better to say nothing of the occurrence. He supposed that Señorita Lolita would tell her parents, and that the despensero would give testimony, but he doubted whether Don Carlos would do anything about it. Don Carlos would think twice before affronting an officer of the army, being the recipient already of the governor's frowns. Ramon only hoped that Don Diego would not learn much of the happening, for if a Vega raised hand against him, the captain would have difficulty maintaining his position. Pacing the floor of his office, Captain Ramon allowed his wrath to grow, and thought on these things and many others. He had kept abreast of the times, and he knew that the governor and the men about him were sorely in need of more funds to waste in riotous living. They had plucked those men of wealth against whom there was the faintest breath of suspicion, and they would welcome a new victim. Might not the captain suggest one, and at the same time strengthen his own position with the governor? Would the captain dare hint that perhaps the Vega family was wavering in its loyalty to the governor? At least he could do one thing, he decided. He could have his revenge for the flouting the daughter of Don Carlos Pulido had given him. Captain Ramon grinned, despite his wrath, as the thought came to him. He called for writing materials, and informed one of his well men that he should prepare for a journey, being about to be named for a courier's job. Ramon paced the floor for some minutes more, thinking on the matter and trying to decide just how to word the epistle he intended writing. And finally he sat down before the long table and addressed his message to His Excellency the Governor, at his mansion in San Francisco de Asís. This is what he wrote. Your intelligences regarding this highwayman, Señor Zorro, as he is known, have come to hand. I regret that I am unable at this writing to report the rogue's capture, but I trust that you will be lenient with me in the matter, since circumstances are somewhat unusual. I have the greater part of my force in pursuit of the fellow, with orders to get him in person or to fetch me his corpse. But this Señor Zorro does not fight alone. He is being given succour at certain places in the neighbourhood, allowed to remain in hiding when necessary, given food and drink, and, no doubt, fresh horses. Within the past day he visited the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido, a caballero known to be hostile to your Excellency. I sent men there, and went myself. While my soldiers took up his trail, the man came from a closet in the living room at Don Carlos's house and attacked me treacherously. He wounded me in the right shoulder, but I fought him off until he became frightened and dashed away, making his escape. I may mention that I was hindered somewhat by this Don Carlos in pursuing the man. Also, when I arrived at the hacienda, indications were that the man had been eating his evening meal there. The Pulido hacienda is an excellent place for such a man to hide, being somewhat off the main highway. I fear that Señor Zorro makes it his headquarters when he is in this vicinity, and I await your instructions in the matter. I may add that Don Carlos scarcely treated me with respect while I was in his presence, and that his daughter, the Señorita Lolita, scarcely could keep from showing her admiration of this highwayman, and from sneering at the efforts of the soldiery to capture him. There are also indications of a famous and wealthy family of this neighbourhood wavering in loyalty to your Excellency, but you will appreciate the fact that I cannot write of such a thing in a missive sent you by courier. With deep respect, Ramon, Comandante and Captain, Presidio, Reina de los Angeles. Ramon grinned again as he finished the letter. That last paragraph, he knew, would get the governor guessing. The Vega family was about the only famous and wealthy one that would fit the description. As for the Pulidos, Captain Ramon imagined what would happen to them. the governor would not hesitate to deal out punishment, and perhaps the Señorita Lolita would find herself without protection, and in no position to reject the advances of a captain of the army. Now Ramon addressed himself to the task of making a second copy of the letter, intending to send one by his courier and preserve the other for his files, in case something came up and he wished to refer to it. Having finished the copy, he folded the original and sealed it, carried it to the soldier's lounging room, and gave it to the man he had selected as courier. The soldier saluted, hurried out to his horse, and rode furiously toward the north, toward San Fernando and Santa Barbara, and on to San Francisco de Assis, with the orders ringing in his ears that he should make all haste and get a change of horses at every mission and pueblo in the name of His Excellency. Ramon returned to his office and poured out a measure of wine, and began reading over the copy of the letter. He half wished that he had made it stronger, yet he knew that it were better to make it mild, for then the governor would not think he was exaggerating. He stopped reading now and then to curse the name of Señor Zorro, and frequently he reflected on the beauty and grace of the Señorita Lolita, and told himself she should be punished for the manner in which she had treated him. He supposed that Señor Zorro was miles away by this time, and putting more miles between himself and Reina de los Angeles. But he was mistaken in that. For the curse of Capistrano, as the soldiers called him, had not hurried away after leaving the house of Don Diego Vega. Chapter 15. At the Presidio. Señor Zorro had gone a short distance through the darkness to where he had left his horse in the rear of a native's hut, and there he stood, thinking of the love that had come to him. Presently he chuckled as if well pleased, then mounted and rode slowly toward the path that led to the Presidio. He heard a horseman galloping away from the place, and thought Captain Ramon had sent a man to call back Sergeant Gonzales and the troopers and put them on the fresher trail. Señor Zorro knew how affairs stood at the Presidio, knew to a man how many of the soldiery were there, and that 4 were ill with a fever, and that there was but one well man now besides the captain, since one had ridden away. He laughed again, and made his horse climb the slope slowly so as to make little noise. In the rear of the Presidio building he dismounted and allowed the reins to drag on the ground, knowing that the animal would not move from the spot. Now he crept through the darkness to the wall of the building, and made his way around it carefully until he came to a window. He raised himself on a pile of adobe bricks and peered inside. It was Captain Ramon's office into which he looked. He saw the Comandante sitting before a table reading a letter which, it appeared, he had just finished writing. Captain Ramon was talking to himself, as does many an evil man. "This will cause consternation for the pretty Señorita," he was saying. "That will teach her not to flaunt an officer of His Excellency's forces. When her father is in the carcel charged with high treason, and his estates have been taken away, then perhaps she will listen to what I have to say." Señor Zorro had no difficulty in distinguishing the words. He guessed instantly that Captain Ramon had planned a revenge, that he contemplated mischief toward the Pulidos. Beneath his mask the face of Señor Zorro grew black with rage. He got down from the pile of adobe bricks and slipped on along the wall until he came to the corner of the building. In a socket at the side of the front door a torch was burning, and the only able-bodied man left in the garrison was pacing back and forth before the doorway, a pistol in his belt and a blade at his side. Señor Zorro noted the length of the man's pacing. He judged the distance accurately, and just as the man turned his back to resume his march, the highwayman sprang. His hands closed around the soldier's throat as his knees struck the man in the back. Instantly they were upon the ground, the surprised trooper now doing his best to put up a fight. But Señor Zorro, knowing that a bit of noise might mean disaster for him, silenced the man by striking him on the temple with the heavy butt of his pistol. He pulled the unconscious soldier back into the shadows, gagged him with a strip torn from the end of his serape, and bound his hands and feet with other strips. Then he drew his cloak about him, looked to his pistol, listened a moment, to be sure the short fight with the soldier had not attracted the attention of any inside the building, and slipped once more toward the door. He was inside in an instant. Before him was the big lounging room with its hard dirt floor. Here were some long tables and bunks and wine mugs and harness and saddles and bridles. Señor Zorro gave it but a glance to assure himself that no man was there, and walked swiftly and almost silently across to the door that opened into the office of the Commandante. He made sure that his pistol was ready for instant use, and then threw the door open boldly. Captain Ramon was seated with his back toward it, and now he whirled around in his chair with a snarl on his lips, thinking one of his men had entered without the preliminary of knocking, and ready to rebuke the man.
"Not a sound, señor," the highwayman warned. "You die if as much as a gasp escapes your lips."
He kept his eyes on those of the Commandante, closed the door behind him, and advanced into the room. He walked forward slowly, without speaking, the pistol held ready in front of him. Captain Ramon had his hands on the table before him, and his face had gone white.
"This visit is necessary, señor, I believe," Señor Zorro said. "I have not made it because I admire the beauty of your face."
"What do you here?" the captain asked, disregarding the order to make no sound, yet speaking in a tone scarcely above a whisper.
"I happened to look in at the window, señor. I saw an epistle before you on the table, and I heard you speak. 'Tis a bad thing for a man to talk to himself. Had you remained silent, I might have gone on about my business. As it is—"
"Well, señor?" the captain asked, with a bit of his old arrogance returning to him.
"I have a mind to read that letter before you."
"Does my military business interest you that much?"
"As to that, we shall say nothing, señor. Kindly remove your hands from the table, but do not reach toward the pistol at your side, unless you wish to die the death instantly. It would not grieve me to have to send your soul into the hereafter."
The Commandante did as he had been directed, and Señor Zorro went forward cautiously and snatched up the letter. Then he retreated a few paces again, still watching the man before him.
"I am going to read this," he said. "But I warn you that I shall watch you closely, also. Do not make a move, señor, unless it is your wish to visit your ancestors."
He read swiftly, and when he had finished he looked the Commandante straight in the eye for some time without speaking, and his own eyes were glittering malevolently through his mask. Captain Ramon began to feel more uncomfortable. Señor Zorro stepped across to the table, still watching the other, and held the letter to the flame of a candle. It caught fire, blazed, presently dropped to the floor a bit of ash. Señor Zorro put one foot upon it.
"The letter will not be delivered," he said.
"So,
you fight women, do you, señor? A brave officer and an ornament to his Excellency's forces. I doubt not he would grant you promotion if he knew of this. You insult a señorita because her father, for the time being, is not friendly with those in power, and because she repulses you as you deserve, you set about to cause trouble for the members of her family. Truly, it is a worthy deed."
He took a step closer and bent forward, still holding the pistol ready before him.
"Let me not hear of you sending any letter similar to the one I have just destroyed," he said. "I regret at the present time that you are unable to stand before me and cross blades. It would be an insult to my sword to run you through, yet would I do it to rid the world of such a fellow."
"You speak bold words to a wounded man."
"No doubt the wound will heal, señor, and I shall keep myself informed regarding it. And when it has healed, and you have back your strength, I shall take the trouble to hunt you up,
and call you to account for what you have attempted doing this night. Let that be understood between us." Again their eyes blazed, each man's into those of the other, and Signor Zorro stepped backward and drew his cloak closer about him. To their ears there came, suddenly, a jangling of harness, the tramp of horses' feet, the raucous voice of Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez.
"Do not dismount,"
the sergeant was crying to his men at the door.
"I but make report, then we go on after the rogue. There shall be no rest until we take him."
Signor Zorro glanced quickly around the room, for he knew escape by the entrance was cut off now. Captain Ramon's eyes flashed with keen anticipation.
"Ho, Gonzales!"
he shrieked before Zorro could warn him against it. "To the rescue, Gonzales! Signor Zorro is here!" And then he looked at the highwayman defiantly, as if telling him to do his worst. But Signor Zorro had no desire to fire his pistol and let out the captain's lifeblood, it appeared, preferring to save him for the blade when his shoulder should have healed.
"Remain where you are,"
he commanded, and darted toward the nearest window. The big sergeant had heard, however. He called upon his men to follow, and rushed across the large room to the door of the office and threw it open. A bellow of rage escaped him as he saw the masked man standing beside the table, and saw the commandante sitting before it with his hands spread out before him.
"By the saints, we have him!" Gonzales cried. "In with you, troopers! Guard the doors! Some look to the windows!"
Signor Zorro had transferred his pistol to his left hand, and had whipped out his blade. Now he swept it forward and sideways, and the candles were struck from the table. Zorro put his foot upon the only one that remained lighted, and extinguished it in that manner, and the room was in darkness.
"Lights! Bring a torch!"
Gonzales shrieked. Signor Zorro sprang aside, against the wall, and made his way around it rapidly, while Gonzales and two other men sprang into the room, and one remained guarding the door, while in the other room several ran to get a torch, and managed to get in one another's way. The man with the torch came rushing through the door finally, and he shrieked and went down with a sword blade through his breast, and the torch fell to the floor and was extinguished. And then, before the sergeant could reach the spot, Signor Zorro was back in the darkness again, and could not be found. Gonzales was roaring his curses now, and searching for the man he wished to slay, and the captain was crying to him to be careful, and not put his blade through a trooper by mistake. The other men were storming around. In the other room one came with a second torch. Zorro's pistol spoke, and the torch was shot from the man's hand. The highwayman sprang forward and stamped upon it, putting it out, and again retreated to the darkness, changing his position rapidly, listening for the deep breathing that would tell him the exact location of his various foes. "Catch the rogue!" the commandante was shrieking. "Can one man thus make fools of the lot of you?" Then he ceased to speak, for Signor Zorro had grasped him from behind and shut off his wind, and now the highwayman's voice rang out above the din. "Soldiers, I have your captain. I am going to carry him before me and back out the door. I am going to cross the other room, and so reach the outside of the building. I have discharged one pistol, but I am holding its mate at the base of the captain's brain. And when one of you attacks me, I fire, and you are without a captain." The captain could feel cold steel at the back of his head, and he shrieked for the men to use caution. And Signor Zorro carried him to the doorway and backed out with the captain held in front of him, while Gonzales and the troopers followed as closely as they dared, watching every move, hoping for a chance to catch him unaware. He crossed the big lounging room of the Presidio, and so came to the outside door. He was somewhat afraid of the men outside, for he knew that some of them had run around the building to guard the windows. The torch was still burning just outside the door, and Signor Zorro put up his hand and tore it down and extinguished it. But still there would be grave danger the moment he stepped out. Gonzales and the troopers were before him, spread out fan fashion across the room, bending forward, waiting for a chance to get in a blow. Gonzales held a pistol in his hand. though he made out to despise the weapon, and was watching for an opportunity to shoot without endangering the life of his captain.
"Back, signores," the highwayman commanded now. "I would have more room in which to make my start. That is it. I thank you. Sergeant Gonzales, were not the odds so heavy, I might be tempted to play at fence with you and disarm you again." "By the saints!" "Some other time, my sergeant. And now, signores, attention. It desolates me to say it, but I had only the one pistol. What the captain has been feeling all this time at the base of his brain is naught except a bridle buckle I picked up from the floor. Is it not a pretty jest? Signores, adios!" Suddenly he whirled the captain forward, darted into the darkness, and started toward his horse with the whole pack at his heels, and pistol flashes splitting the blackness of the night, and bullets whistling by his head. His laughter came back to them on the stiffening breeze that blew in from the distant sea. Chapter 16. The Chase That Failed. Señor Zorro urged his horse down the treacherous slope of the hill, where there was loose gravel and a misstep would spell disaster, and where the troopers were slow to follow. Sergeant Gonzales possessed courage enough, and some of the men followed him, while others galloped off to right and left, planning to intercept the fugitive when he reached the bottom and turned. Señor Zorro, however, was before them, and took the trail toward San Gabriel at a furious gallop, while the troopers dashed along behind, calling to one another, and now and then discharging a pistol with a great waste of powder and ball, and no result so far as capturing or wounding the highwayman was concerned. Soon the moon came up. Señor Zorro had been anticipating that, and knew that it would make his escape more difficult. But his horse was fresh and strong, while those ridden by the troopers had covered many miles during the day, and so hope was not gone. Now he could be seen plainly by those who pursued, and he could hear Sergeant Gonzales crying upon his men to urge their beasts to the utmost and effect a capture. He glanced behind him as he rode, and observed that the troopers were scattering out in a long line, the stronger and fresher horses gaining on the others. So they rode for some 5 miles, the troopers holding the distance but not making any gain, and Señor Zorro knew that soon their horses would weaken, and that the good steed he bestrode, which gave no signs of fatigue as yet, would outdistance them. Only one thing bothered him. He wanted to be travelling in the opposite direction. Here the hills rose abruptly on either side of the highway, and it was not possible for him to turn aside and make a great circle, nor were there any trails he could follow, and if he attempted to have his horse climb, he would have to make slow progress, and the troopers would come near enough to fire their pistols and mayhap wound him. So he rode straight ahead, gaining a bit now, knowing that 2 miles further up the valley there was a trail that swung off to the right, and that by following it he would come to higher ground and so could double back on his tracks. He had covered one of the 2 miles before he remembered that it had been noised abroad that a landslide had been caused by the recent torrential rain and had blocked this higher trail. So he could not use that even when he reached it, and now a bold thought came to his mind. As he topped a slight rise in the terrain, he glanced behind once more and saw that no 2 of the troopers were riding side by side. They were well scattered, and there was some distance between each 2 of them. It would help his plan. He dashed around a bend in the highway and pulled up his horse. He turned the animal's head back toward whence he had come and bent forward in the saddle to listen. When he could hear the hoof-beats of his nearest pursuer's horse, he drew his blade, took a turn of the reins around his left wrist, and suddenly struck his beast in the flanks cruelly with his sharp rowels. The animal he rode was not used to such treatment, never having felt the spurs except when in a gallop and his master wished greater speed. Now he sprang forward like a thunderbolt, dashed around the curve like a wild stallion, and bore down upon the nearest of Señor Zorro's foes. "Make way!" Señor Zorro cried. The first man gave ground readily, not sure that this was the highwayman coming back, and when he was sure of it,
He shrieked the intelligence to those behind, but they could not understand because of the clatter of hoofs on the hard road. Signor Zorro bore down upon the second man, clashed swords with him, and rode on. He dashed around another curve, and his horse struck another fairly, and hurled him from the roadway. Zorro swung at the fourth man and missed him, and was glad that the fellow's counterstroke missed as well. And now there was naught but the straight ribbon of road before him, and his galloping foes dotting it. Like a maniac he rode them through, cutting and slashing at them as he passed. Sergeant Gonzales, far in the rear because of his jaded mount, realized what was taking place and screeched at his men, and even as he screeched a thunderbolt seemed to strike his horse, unseating him. And then Signor Zorro was through them and gone, and they were following him again, a cursing sergeant at their head, but at a distance slightly greater than before. He allowed his horse to go somewhat slower now, since he could keep his distance, and rode to the first cross-trail, into which he turned. He took to higher ground, and he looked back to see the pursuit streaming out over the hill, losing itself in the distance, but still determined. "It was an excellent trick," Signor Zorro said to his horse, "but we cannot try it often." He passed the hacienda of a man friendly to the governor, and a thought came to him. Gonzales might stop there and obtain fresh horses for himself and his men. Nor was he mistaken in that. The troopers dashed up the driveway, and dogs howled a welcome. The master of the hacienda came to the door, holding a candelero high above his head. "We chase Signor Zorro!" Gonzales cried. "We require fresh steeds in the name of the governor." The servants were called, and Gonzales and his men hurried to the corral. Magnificent horses were there, horses almost as good as the one the highwayman rode, and all were fresh. The troopers quickly stripped saddles and bridles from their jaded mounts, and put them on the fresh steeds, and then dashed for the trail again, and took up the pursuit. Signor Zorro had gained quite a lead, but there was only one trail he could follow, and they might overtake him. 3 miles away, on the crest of a small hill, there was a hacienda that had been presented to the mission of San Gabriel by a caballero who had died without leaving heirs. The governor had threatened to take it for the state, but so far had not done so, the Franciscans of San Gabriel having a name for protecting their property with determination. In charge of this hacienda was one Fray Felipe, a member of the order who was along in years, and under his direction the neophytes made the estate a profitable one, raising much livestock, and sending to the storehouses great amounts of hides and tallow and honey and fruit, as well as wine. Gonzales knew the trail they were following led to this hacienda, and that just beyond it there was another trail that split, one part going to San Gabriel, and the other returning to Reina de los Angeles by a longer route. If Signor Zorro passed the hacienda, it stood to reason that he would take the trail that ran toward the pueblo, since, had he wished to go to San Gabriel, he would have continued along the highway in the first place, instead of turning and riding back through the troopers at some risk to himself. But he doubted whether Zorro would pass, for it was well known that the highwaymen dealt harshly with those who prosecuted the frailes, and it was to be believed that every Franciscan held a friendly feeling for him and would give him aid. The troopers came within sight of the hacienda, and could see no light. Gonzales stopped them where the driveway started, and listened in vain for sounds of the man they pursued. He dismounted and inspected the dusty road, but could not tell whether a horseman had ridden toward the house recently. He issued quick orders, and the troops separated, half of the men remaining with their sergeant, and the others scattering in such manner that they could surround the house, search the huts of the natives, and look at the great barns. Then Sergeant Gonzales rode straight up the highway with half his men at his back, forced his horse up the steps to the veranda as a sign that he held this place in little respect, and knocked on the door with the hilt of his sword. Chapter 17. Sergeant Gonzales meets a friend. Presently light showed through the windows, and after a time the door was thrown open. Fray Felipe stood framed in it, shading a candle with his hand, a giant of a man now past 60, but one who had been a power in his time.
"What is all this noise?" he demanded in his deep voice. "And why do you, son of evil, ride your horse on my veranda?" "We are chasing this pretty Señor Zorro, Fray, this man they call the Curse of Capistrano," Gonzales said. "And you expect to find him in this poor house?" "Stranger things have happened. Answer me, Fray. Have you heard a horseman gallop past within a short time?" "I have not." "And has this Señor Zorro paid you a visit recently?" "I do not know the man you mean."
"You have heard of him, doubtless."
"I have heard that he seeks to aid the oppressed, that he has punished those who have committed sacrilege, and that he has whipped those brutes who have beaten Indians."
"You are bold in your words, Fray."
"It is my nature to speak the truth, soldier."
"You will be getting yourselves into difficulties with the powers, my robed Franciscan."
"I fear no politician, soldier."
"I do not like the tone of your words, Fray. I have half a mind to dismount and give you a taste of my whip."
"Señor," Fray Felipe cried, "take 10 years off my shoulders and I can drag you in the dirt."
"That is a question for dispute. However, let us get to the subject of this visit. You have not seen a masked fiend who goes by the name of Señor Zorro?"
"I have not, soldier."
"I shall have my men search your house."
"You accuse me of falsehood?"
Fray Felipe cried. "My men must do something to pass the time, and they may as well search the house. You have nothing you wish to hide?"
"Recognizing the identity of my guests, it might be well to hide the wine jugs," Fray Felipe said. Sergeant Gonzales allowed an oath to escape him, and he got down from his horse. The others dismounted too, and the sergeant's mount was taken off the veranda and left with the horseholder. Then Gonzales drew off his gloves, sheathed his sword, and stamped through the door with the others at his heels, as Fray Felipe fell back before him, protesting against the intrusion. From a couch in a far corner of the room there arose a man who stepped into the circle of light cast by the candelero. "As I have eyes, it is my raucous friend," he cried.
"Don Diego, you here?"
Gonzales gasped. "I have been at my hacienda looking over business affairs, and I rode over to spend the night with Fray Felipe, who has known me from babyhood. These turbulent times, I thought that here, at least, in this hacienda that is a bit out of the way and has a Fray in charge of it, I could for a time rest in peace without hearing of violence and bloodshed. But it appears that I cannot. Is there no place in this country where a man may meditate and consult musicians and the poets?"
"Meal mushing goat's milk!" Gonzales cried. "Don Diego, you are my good friend and a true caballero. Tell me, have you seen the Señor Zorro tonight?"
"I have not, my sergeant."
"You did not hear him ride past the hacienda?"
"I did not. But a man could ride past and not be heard here in the house. Fray Felipe and I have been talking together, and were just about to retire when you came."
"Then the rogue has ridden on and taken the trail toward the pueblo,"
the sergeant declared. "You had him in view?" Don Diego asked.
"Ha! We were upon his heels, caballero. But at a turn in the highroad he made connection with some 20 men of his band. They rode at us and attempted to scatter us, but we drove them aside and kept on after Señor Zorro. We managed to separate him from his fellows and give chase."
"You say he has a score of men?"
"Fully a score, as my men will testify. He is a thorn in the flesh of the soldiery, but I have sworn to get him, and when once we stand face to face—"
"You will tell me of it afterward?" Don Diego asked, rubbing his hands together. "You will relate how you mocked him as he fought, how you played with him, pressed him back, and ran him through."
By the saints, you make mock of me, caballero!
"'Tis but a jest, my sergeant. Now that we understand each other, perhaps Fray Felipe will give wine to you and your men. After such a chase, you must be fatigued."
Wine would taste good, the sergeant said.
His corporal came in then to report that the huts and barns had been searched, and the corral also, and that no trace had been found of Señor Zorro or his horse. Fray Felipe served the wine, though he appeared to do it with some reluctance, and it was plain that he was but answering Don Diego's request.
"And what shall you do now, my sergeant?" Don Diego asked after the wine had been brought to the table. "Are you always to go chasing around the country and creating a tumult?"
The rogue evidently has turned back toward Reina de los Angeles, caballero, the sergeant replied. He thinks he is clever, no doubt, but I can understand his plan.
"Ha! And what is it?"
He will ride around Reina de los Angeles and take the trail to San Luis Rey. He will rest for a time, no doubt, to throw off all pursuit, and then will continue to the vicinity of San Juan Capistrano. That is where he began this wild life of his, and for that reason the curse of Capistrano he is called. Yes, he will go to Capistrano.
"And the soldiers?" Don Diego asked.
We shall follow him leisurely. We shall work toward the place. And when the news of his next outrage is made known, we shall be within a short distance of him instead of in the presidio at the pueblo. We can find the fresh trail, and so take up the chase. There shall be no rest for us until the rogue is either slain or taken prisoner.
"And you have the reward," Don Diego added.
You speak true words, caballero. The reward will come in handy. But I seek revenge also. The rogue disarmed me once.
"Ah, that was the time he held a pistol in your face and forced you to fight not too well?"
That was the time, my good friend. Oh, I have a score to settle with him.
"These turbulent times," Don Diego sighed. "I would they were at an end. A man has no chance for meditation. There are moments when I think I shall ride far out in the hills, where there can be found no life except rattlesnakes and coyotes, and there spend a couple of days. Only in that manner may a man meditate."
Why meditate? Gonzales cried. Why not cease thought and take to action? What a man you would make, caballero, if you let your eye flash now and then, and quarreled a bit, and showed your teeth once in a while. What you need is a few bitter enemies.
"May the saints preserve us!" Don Diego cried.
It is the truth, caballero. Fight a bit. Make love to some señorita. Get drunk. Wake up and be a man.
"Upon my soul, you almost persuade me, my sergeant. But no, I never could endure the exertion."
Gonzales growled something into his great mustache and got up from the table.
I have no special liking for you, Fray, but I thank you for the wine, which was excellent, he said. We must continue our journey. A soldier's duty never is at an end while he lives.
"Do not speak of journeys," Don Diego cried. "I must take one myself on the morrow. My business at the hacienda is done, and I go back to the pueblo."
Let me express the hope, my good friend, that you survive the hardship, Sergeant Gonzales said.
Chapter 18. Don Diego returns. Señorita Lolita had to tell her parents, of course, what had happened during their absence, for the despensero knew, and would tell Don Diego when he returned, and the señorita was wise enough to realize that it would be better to make the first explanation. The despensero, having been sent for wine, knew nothing of the love scene that had been enacted, and had been told merely that Señor Zorro had hurried away. That seemed reasonable, since the señor was pursued by the soldiers. So the girl told her father and mother that Captain Ramon had called while they were absent, and that he had forced his way into the big living room to speak to her, despite the entreaties of the servant. Perhaps he had been drinking too much wine, else was not himself because of his wound, the girl explained. But he grew too bold, and pressed his suit with ardour that was repugnant, and finally insisted that he should have a kiss. Whereupon, said the señorita, this Señor Zorro had stepped from the corner of the room, and how he came to be there she did not know, and had forced Captain Ramon to apologize, and then had thrown him out of the house. After which, and here she neglected to tell the entire truth, Señor Zorro made a courteous bow and hurried away. Don Carlos was for getting a blade and going at once to the Presidio and challenging Captain Ramon to mortal combat. But Dona Catalina was more calm, and showed him that to do that would be to let the world know that their daughter had been affronted, and also it would not aid their fortunes any if Don Carlos quarrelled with an officer of the army. And yet again, the Don was of an age, and the captain probably would run him through in 2 passes, and leave Dona Catalina a weeping widow, which she did not wish to be. So the Don paced the floor of the great living room and fumed and fussed, and wished he were 10 years the younger, or that he had political power again, and he promised that when his daughter should have wedded Don Diego, and he was once more in good standing, he would see that Captain Ramon was disgraced and his uniform torn from his shoulders. Sitting in the chamber that had been assigned to her, Señorita Lolita listened to her father's ravings, and found herself confronted with a situation. Of course, she could not wed Don Vega now. She had given her lips and her love to another, a man whose face she never had seen, a rogue pursued by soldiery, and she had spoken truly when she had said that a pulido loved but once. She tried to explain it all to herself, saying that it was a generous impulse that had forced her to give her lips to the man. And she told herself that it was not the truth, that her heart had been stirred when first he spoke to her at her father's hacienda during the siesta hour. She was not prepared yet to tell her parents of the love that had come into her life, for it was sweet to keep it a secret. And moreover, she dreaded the shock to them, and half feared that her father might cause her to be sent away to some place where she never would see Señor Zorro again. She crossed to a window and gazed out at the plaza, and she saw Don Diego approaching in the distance. He rode slowly, as if greatly fatigued, and his 2 native servants rode a short distance behind him. Men called to him as he neared the house, and he waved his hand at them languidly in response to their greeting. He dismounted slowly, one of the natives holding the stirrup and assisting him, brushed the dust from his clothes, and started toward the door. Don Carlos and his wife were upon their feet to greet him, their faces beaming, for they had been accepted anew into society the evening before, and knew it was because they were Don Diego's house guests. "I regret that I was not here when you arrived," Don Diego said, "but I trust that you have been made comfortable in my poor house."
"More than comfortable in this gorgeous palace," Don Carlos exclaimed.
"Then you have been fortunate, for the saints know I have been uncomfortable enough." "How is that, Don Diego?" Dona Catalina asked. "My work at the hacienda done, I rode as far as the place of Fray Felipe, there to spend the night in quiet. But as we were about to retire, there came a thundering noise at the door, and this Sergeant Gonzales and a troop of soldiers entered. It appears that they had been chasing the highwayman called Señor Zorro, and had lost him in the darkness." In the other room, a dainty señorita gave thanks for that. "These are turbulent times," Don Diego continued, sighing and mopping the perspiration from his forehead. "The noisy fellows were with us an hour or more, and then continued the chase. And because of what they had said of violence, I endured a horrible nightmare, so got very little rest. And this morning I was forced to continue to Reina de los Angeles."
"You have a difficult time," Don Carlos said. "Señor Zorro was here, caballero, in your house, before the soldiers chased him."
What is this intelligence? Don Diego cried, sitting up straight in his chair and betraying sudden interest. Undoubtedly he came to steal, else to abduct you and hold you for ransom, Dona Catalina observed. But I scarcely think that he stole. Don Carlos and myself were visiting friends, and Señorita Lolita remained here alone. There is a distressing affair to report to you. I beg of you to proceed, Don Diego said. While we were gone, Captain Ramon of the Presidio called. He was informed we were absent, but he forced his way into the house and made himself obnoxious to the señorita. This Señor Zorro came in and forced the captain to apologize, and then drove him away. Well, that is what I call a pretty bandit, Don Diego exclaimed. The señorita suffers from the experience? Indeed, no, said Dona Catalina. She was of the opinion that Captain Ramon had taken too much wine. I shall call her. Dona Catalina went to the door of the chamber and called her daughter, and Lolita came into the room and greeted Don Diego as became a proper maiden. It makes me desolate to know that you received an insult in my house, Don Diego said. I shall consider the affair. Dona Catalina made a motion to her husband, and they went to a far corner to sit, that the young folk might be somewhat alone, which seemed to please Don Diego, but not the señorita. Chapter 19. Captain Ramon Apologizes. Captain Ramon is a beast, the girl said in a voice not too loud. He is a worthless fellow, Don Diego agreed. He wished to kiss me, she said. And you did not let him, of course? Señor! Confound it, I did not mean that. Certainly you did not let him. I trust that you slapped his face. I did, said the señorita. And then he struggled with me, and he told me that I should not be so particular, since I am a daughter of a man who stood in the bad graces of the governor. Why, the infernal brute! Don Diego exclaimed. Is that all you have to say about it, caballero? I cannot use oaths in your presence, of course. Do you not understand, señor? This man comes into your house and insulted the girl you have asked to be your wife. Confound the rascal! When next I see his excellency, I shall ask him to remove the officer to some other post. Oh, the girl cried, have you no spirit at all? Have him removed? Were you a proper man, Don Diego, you would go to the Presidio, you would call this Captain Ramon to account, you would pass your sword through his body, and call upon all to witness that a man could not insult the señorita you admired and escape the consequences. It is such an exertion to fight, he said. Let us not speak of violence. Perhaps I shall see the fellow and rebuke him. Rebuke him? The girl cried. Let us talk of something else, señorita. Let us speak of the matter regarding which I talked the other day. My father will be after me again soon to know when I am going to take a wife. Cannot we get the matter settled in some manner? Have you decided upon the day? I have not said that I would marry you, she replied. Why hold off? He questioned. Have you looked at my house? I shall make it satisfactory to you, I am sure. You shall furnish it to suit your taste, though I pray you do not disturb it too much, for I dislike to have things in a mess. You shall have a new carriage, and anything you may desire. Is this your manner of wooing? She asked, glancing at him from the corners of her eyes. What a nuisance to woo, he said. Must I play a guitar and make pretty speeches? Can you not give me your answer without all that foolishness? She was comparing this man beside her with Señor Zorro, and Don Diego did not compare to him favorably. She wanted to be done with this farce, to have Don Diego out of her vision, and none but Señor Zorro in it. I must speak frankly to you, caballero, she said. I have searched my heart, and in it I find no love for you. I am sorry,
for I know what our marriage would mean to my parents and to myself in a financial way. But I cannot wed you, Don Diego, and it is useless for you to ask." "Well, by the saints, I had thought it was all about settled," he said. "Do you hear that, Don Carlos? Your daughter says she cannot wed with me, that it is not in her heart to do so." "Lolita, retire to your chamber," Dona Catalina exclaimed. The girl did so gladly. Don Carlos and his wife hurried across the room and sat down beside Don Diego.
"I fear you do not understand women, my friend," Don Carlos said. "Never must you take a woman's answer for the last. She always may change her mind. A woman likes to keep a man dangling, likes to make him blow cold with fear and hot with anticipation. Let her have her moods, my friend. In the end, I'm sure, you shall have your way."
"It is beyond me," Don Diego cried. "What shall I do now? I told her I would give her all her heart desired." "Her heart desires love, I suppose," Dona Catalina said, out of the wealth of her woman's wisdom. "Yet certainly I shall love and cherish her. Does not a man promise that in the ceremony? Would a Vega break his word regarding such a thing?"
"Just a little courtship," Don Carlos urged.
"But it is such a nuisance."
"A few soft words, a pressure of the hand now and then, a sigh or two, a languishing look from the eyes."
"Nonsense!"
"It is what a maiden expects. Speak not of marriage for some time. Let the idea grow on her."
"But my august father is liable to come to the pueblo any day and ask when I am to take a wife. He has rather ordered me to do it."
"No doubt your father will understand," said Don Carlos. "Tell him that her mother and myself are on your side, and that you are enjoying the pleasure of winning the girl."
"I believe we should return to the hacienda tomorrow," Dona Catalina put in. "Lolita has seen this splendid house, and she will contrast it with ours. She will realize what it means to marry you. And there is an ancient saying that when a man and a maid are apart, they grow fonder of each other." "I do not wish to have you hurry away." "I think it would be best under the circumstances. And do you ride out, say, in 3 days, caballero, and I doubt not you will find her more willing to listen to your suit." "I presume you know best," Don Diego said, "but you must remain at least until tomorrow. And now I think I shall go to the Presidio and see this Captain Ramon. Possibly that will please the señorita. She appears to think I should call him to account." Don Carlos thought that such a course would prove disastrous for a man who did not practise with the blade and knew little of fighting, but he refrained from saying so. A gentleman never intruded his own thoughts at such a time. Even if a caballero went to his death, it was all right so long as he believed he was doing the proper thing, and died as a caballero should. So Don Diego went from the house and walked slowly up the hill toward the Presidio building. Captain Ramon observed his approach, and wondered at it, and snarled at the thought of coming to combat with such a man. But he was cold courtesy itself when Don Diego was ushered into the Commandante's office. "I am proud to know you have visited me here," he said, bowing low before the scion of the Vegas. Don Diego bowed in answer, and took the chair Captain Ramon indicated. The captain marvelled that Don Diego had no blade at his side. "I was forced to climb your confounded hill to speak to you on a certain matter," Don Diego said. "I have been informed that you visited my house during my absence and insulted a young lady who is my guest." "Indeed?" the captain said. "Were you deep in wine?"
"Signor?"
"That would excuse the offence in part, of course. And then you were wounded, and probably in a fever. Were you in a fever, Captain?"
"Undoubtedly," Ramon said.
"A fever is an awful thing. I had a siege of it once. But you should not have intruded upon the señorita. Not only did you affront her, but you affronted me. I have asked the señorita to become my wife. The matter is not settled as yet, but I have some rights in this case."
"I entered your house seeking news of this Señor Zorro," the captain lied.
"You, found him?"
Don Diego asked. The face of the Comandante flushed red.
"The fellow was there, and he attacked me," he replied. "I was wounded, of course, and wore no weapon, and so he could work his will with me."
"It is a most remarkable thing," observed Don Diego, "that none of your soldiers can meet this curse of Capistrano when you can be on equal terms. Always he descends upon you when you are helpless, or threatens you with a pistol while he fights you with a blade, or has his score of men about him. I met Sergeant Gonzales and his men at the hacienda of Fray Felipe last night, and the big sergeant told some harrowing tale of the highwayman and his score of men scattering his troopers."
"We shall get him yet," the captain promised. "And I might call your attention to certain significant things, caballero. Don Carlos Pulido, as we know, does not stand high with those in authority. This Señor Zorro was at the Pulido hacienda, you will remember, and attacked me there, emerging from a closet to do it."
"Ha! What mean you?"
"Again, on last night he was in your house while you were abroad and the Pulidos were your guests. It begins to look as if Don Carlos has a hand in the work of the Señor Zorro. I am almost convinced that Don Carlos is a traitor, and is aiding the rogue. You had better think twice, or half a score of times, before seeking a matrimonial alliance with the daughter of such a man."
"By the saints, what a speech!"
Don Diego exclaimed, as if in admiration.
"You have made my poor head ring with it. You really believe all this?"
"I do, caballero."
"Well, the Pulidos are returning to their own place tomorrow, I believe. I but asked them to be my guests, so they could be away from the scenes of this Señor Zorro's deeds."
"And Señor Zorro followed them to the pueblo, you see."
"Can it be possible?" Don Diego gasped. "I must consider the matter. Oh, these turbulent times! But they are returning to their hacienda tomorrow. Of course, I would not have his Excellency think that I harboured a traitor."
He got to his feet, bowed courteously, and then stepped slowly toward the door. And there he seemed to remember something suddenly, and turned to face the captain again.
"Ha! I am at the point of forgetting all about the insult," he exclaimed. "What have you to say, my captain, regarding the events of last night?"
"Of course, caballero, I apologize to you most humbly," Captain Ramon replied.
"I suppose that I must accept your apology. But please do not let such a thing happen again. You frightened my despensero badly, and he is an excellent servant."
Then Don Diego Vega bowed again and left the presidio, and Captain Ramon laughed long and loudly, until the sick men in the hospital room feared that their commandante must have lost his wits. "What a man!" the captain exclaimed. "I have turned him away from that Pulido señorita, I think. And I was fool to hint to the governor that he could be capable of treason. I must rectify that matter in some way. The man has not enough spirit to be a traitor." Chapter 20 Don Diego Shows Interest. The threatened rain did not come that day, nor that night, and the following morning found the sun shining brightly, and the sky blue, and the scent of blossoms in the air. Soon after the morning meal, the Pulido carreta was driven to the front of the house by Don Diego's servants, and Don Carlos and his wife and daughter prepared to depart for their own hacienda.
"It desolates me," Don Diego said at the door, "that there can be no match between the señorita and myself. What shall I say to my father?"
"Do not give up hope, caballero," Don Carlos advised him. "Perhaps when we are home again, and Lolita contrasts our humble abode with your magnificence here, she will change her mind. A woman changes her mind, caballero, as often as she does the method of doing her hair."
"I had thought all would be arranged before now," Don Diego said. "You think there is still hope?"
"I trust so,"
Don Carlos said, but he doubted it, remembering the look that had been in the señorita's face. However, he intended having a serious talk with her once they were home, and possibly might decide to insist on obedience even in this matter of taking a mate. So the usual courtesies were paid, and then the lumbering carreta was driven away, and Don Diego Vega turned back into his house with his head hanging upon his breast, as it always hung when he did himself the trouble to think. Presently he decided that he needed companionship for the moment, and left the house to cross the plaza and enter the tavern. The fat landlord rushed to greet him, conducted him to a choice seat near a window, and fetched wine without being commanded to do so. Don Diego spent the greater part of an hour looking through the window at the plaza, watching men and women come and go, observing the toiling natives, and now and then glancing up the trail that ran toward the San Gabriel road. Down this trail, presently, he observed approaching 2 mounted men, and between their horses walked a third man, and Don Diego could see that ropes ran from this man's waist to the saddles of the horsemen. "What in the name of the saints have we here?" he exclaimed, getting up from the bench and going closer to the window.
"Ha!"
said the landlord at his shoulder.
"That will be some prisoner coming now."
"Prisoner?" said Don Diego, looking at him with a question in his glance.
"A native brought the news a short time ago, caballero. Once more a fray is in the toils."
"Explain, fat one."
"The man is to go before the magistrado immediately for his trial. They say that he swindled a dealer in hides, and now must pay the penalty. He wished his trial at San Gabriel, but that was not allowed, since all there are in favor of the missions and the frailes."
"Who is this man?" Don Diego asked.
"He is called Fray Felipe, caballero."
"What is this? Fray Felipe is an old man and my good friend. I spent night before the last with him at the hacienda he manages."
"No doubt he has imposed upon you, caballero, as upon others," the landlord said.
Don Diego showed some slight interest now. He walked briskly from the tavern and went to the office of the magistrado, in a little adobe building on the opposite side of the plaza. The horsemen were just arriving with their prisoner. They were 2 soldiers who had been stationed at San Gabriel, the frailes having been forced to give them bed and board in the governor's name. It was Fray Felipe. He had been forced to walk the entire distance fastened to the saddles of his guards, and there were indications that the horsemen had galloped now and then to test the Fray's power of endurance. Fray Felipe's gown was almost in rags, and was covered with dust and perspiration. Those who crowded around him now gave him jeers and coarse jests, but the Fray held his head proudly, and pretended not to see or hear them. The soldiers dismounted and forced him into the magistrado's office, and the loiterers and natives crowded forward and through the door. Don Diego hesitated a moment, and then stepped toward the door. "One side, scum!" he cried, and the natives gave way before him. He entered and pressed through the throng. The magistrado saw him and beckoned him to a front seat, but Don Diego did not care to sit at that time. "What is it we have here?" he demanded. "This is Fray Felipe, a godly man and my friend."
"He is a swindler," one of the soldiers retorted.
"If he is, then we can put our trust in no man," Don Diego observed.
"All this is quite irregular, caballero," the magistrado insisted, stepping forward. "The charges have been preferred, and the man is here to be tried."
Then Don Diego sat down and court was convened. The man who made the complaint was an evil-looking fellow, who explained that he was a dealer in tallow and hides, and had a warehouse in San Gabriel.
"I went to the hacienda this Fray manages and purchased 10 hides of him," he testified, "after giving him the coins in payment, and taking them to my storehouse. I found that the hides had not been cured properly. In fact, they were ruined. I returned to the hacienda and told the Fray as much, demanding that he return the money, which he refused to do." "The hides were good," Fray Felipe put in. "I told him I would return the money when he returned the hides."
They were spoiled," the dealer declared. "My assistant here will testify as much. They caused a stench, and I had them burned immediately." The assistant testified as much. "Have you anything to say, Fray?" the magistrado asked. "It will avail me nothing," Fray Felipe said. "I am already found guilty and sentenced. Were I a follower of a licentious governor instead of a robed Franciscan, the hides would have been good." "You speak treason," the magistrado cried. "I speak truth." The magistrado puckered his lips and frowned. "There has been entirely too much of this swindling," he said finally. "Because a man wears a robe he cannot rob with impunity. In this case, I deem it proper to make an example, that frailes will see that they cannot take advantage of their calling. The fray must repay the man the price of the hides, and for the swindle he shall receive across his bare back 10 lashes, and for the words of treason he has spoken, he shall receive 5 lashes additional. It is a sentence.